He arrived without warning. I didn't know he was watching. But the millionaire saw me and his 4 children, and love hit him like a storm. I still remember that exact moment. How cold the air was, the faint smell of rain heavy in the New York evening, and how his eyes found me across the garden while I was folding tiny clothes for 4 children who weren't mine. Nobody else saw me there, invisible as always, except him. And in that moment, I realized just how deep my silence had buried me. Maybe you're taking care of children whose parents never notice your efforts, or cleaning up while the house is quiet. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret Sullivan, but everyone called me Maggie. At 63 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. I was wrong. This story begins on a Tuesday evening in November, when the first snow was threatening to dust the sidewalks of Manhattan's Upper East Side. I was standing in the kitchen of the Whitmore Mansion, a towering limestone fortress on Fifth Avenue that overlooked Central Park like a silent guardian of old money and older secrets. The house smelled of expensive candles and fresh flowers that arrived every Monday morning from the finest florist in the city. Persian rugs covered marble floors that reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes. But I wasn't there to admire the beauty. I was there because someone had to love the children who lived in all that splendor, but had never truly been seen by their own parents. Catherine Whitmore was 38, blonde and beautiful in that cold, untouchable way that comes with inheriting millions before you turn 25. She spent her days at charity luncheons and her evenings at gallery openings, always dressed in clothes that cost more than I made in 6 months. Her husband Richard was 42 and managed the family's vast fortune through investments in stocks, real estate, and even cryptocurrency. Bitcoin portfolios that fluctuated by hundreds of thousands of dollars, while I counted pennies for the children's snack money. Their wealth was staggering. The Whitmore family had built their fortune over 3 generations through steel, oil, and strategic investments that turned millions into hundreds of millions. Richard's personal net worth was estimated at over $400 million. With assets spread across Manhattan real estate, tech stock portfolios, and international holdings that generated dividend income beyond most people's wildest dreams. Yet for all their money, all their capital and business success, they couldn't buy what their children needed most: time, attention, and genuine love. I had been their nanny for 18 months when everything changed. 18 months of waking at 5:30 every morning to prepare breakfast for Emma, age 9, Jake, age 7, Sophie, age 5, and little Matthew, just 3 years old. 18 months of packing lunches, tying shoelaces, reading bedtime stories to children who clung to my voice because it was the only consistent warmth in their grand, echo-filled world. The children were beautiful. Each one a small miracle wrapped in designer clothes and private school uniforms. Emma had her mother's blonde hair, but none of her coldness. She was thoughtful, always asking questions about why the sky was blue or where babies came from. Jake was pure energy, a whirlwind of scraped knees and chocolate-stained shirts who made me laugh even on my most exhausting days. Sophie was my little artist, constantly drawing pictures of flowers and princesses that she'd taped to my bedroom door when she thought I wasn't looking. And Matthew, sweet precious Matthew, still called me Gaggy because he couldn't pronounce my name properly, and it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. But their parents barely knew them. Catherine would breeze through the kitchen in her Chanel suits, kissing the air near their faces so she wouldn't smudge her lipstick. Richard was even worse, a ghost in an expensive suit who lived in his study surrounded by multiple computer screens showing stock market data and cryptocurrency prices that changed by the second. Sometimes entire days would pass without either parent having a real conversation with their children. That's where I came in. I was the one who held Sophie when she had nightmares. I was the one who helped Jake with his homework while he sat at the kitchen counter, legs swinging freely from the tall stool. I was the one who sang lullabies to Matthew when he missed his parents, though he was too young to understand why they were never there to read him bedtime stories. And I was the one who listened to Emma's fears about starting 4th grade, holding her small hand while she cried about being different from the other kids whose parents actually came to school events. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman who had lost her own daughter 25 years ago, pouring all my maternal love into children who weren't mine, while their actual parents counted their millions and planned their next investment strategies. My Sarah had been just 6 when leukemia took her, and in the years since, I had tried to fill that hollow space in my chest by caring for other people's children. But the Whitmore children were different. They had crawled so deep into my heart that I sometimes forgot they weren't really mine. The household routine was as precise as Richard's financial spreadsheets. I would wake before dawn and tiptoe downstairs to start breakfast, usually fresh fruit, whole grain toast, and the kind of organic yogurt that cost $8 a container. The children would come down like sleepy angels, hair messy from their silk pillowcases, still in their expensive pajamas that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Good morning, my darlings," I would whisper, and they would light up like Christmas morning. Emma would wrap her arms around my waist, still warm with sleep. Jake would steal a piece of melon from the fruit bowl before I could stop him, grinning his gap-toothed smile. Sophie would show me whatever she had drawn the night before, usually another picture of our little family, with me standing in the center, holding all 4 of them. Those drawings broke my heart every time. In Sophie's innocent eyes, I was their mother figure, the one who belonged in the center of their world. But I knew the truth that she was too young to understand. I was just an employee, paid to love them while their real parents were too busy managing their vast business empire to notice what was happening in their own home. Catherine paid me $700 a week, which sounds generous until you realize I worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. No overtime, no paid vacation, no health insurance. When I did the math, I was making less than minimum wage to raise their children while they accumulated more wealth through stock dividends and real estate investments that earned them more in a day than I made in 6 months. But I stayed because of the children. How could I leave Emma when she was struggling with reading and only trusted me to help her practice? How could I abandon Jake when he had finally started opening up about being bullied at his elite private school? How could I turn my back on Sophie, who drew me pictures every day because she wanted to make me smile? And Matthew, precious Matthew, still needed someone to hold him when he cried for parents who were always too busy to comfort him. The loneliness was crushing sometimes. I lived in a small room on the 4th floor of the mansion, tucked away where visitors wouldn't see me. It had a narrow window that looked out over the service alley, not the park view that the family enjoyed. My furniture was simple: a twin bed, a small dresser, and a chair where I would sit and write letters to my sister in Ohio, the only family I had left. The isolation was worse than the financial exploitation. At family dinners, I would serve the meal and then disappear back to the kitchen to eat alone, while the Whitmores sat at their mahogany table, worth more than most people's cars. During holidays, I would watch from the kitchen doorway as they exchanged expensive gifts: luxury watches, designer jewelry, gadgets that cost thousands of dollars, while I received nothing but a generic card with my name hastily scrawled inside. But the children remembered me. On my birthday last year, Emma had saved her allowance for 3 weeks to buy me a small potted plant from the corner deli. Jake made me a card with his careful 2nd grade handwriting that said, "Thank you for being the best Maggie ever." Sophie drew me a picture of our hands holding each other, with hearts floating all around us. And Matthew, sweet little Matthew, picked me dandelions from the park and presented them like they were roses from the finest florist in Manhattan. Those small gestures kept me alive inside. They reminded me that love doesn't come from stock portfolios or cryptocurrency investments or assets that generate passive income. Love comes from showing up, from being present, from caring more about a child's scraped knee than your dinner reservation at the newest trendy restaurant. The household staff barely acknowledged my existence. The full-time housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, was kind enough, but she had her own work to focus on. The cook, James, was polite but distant. The driver, Michael, nodded when he saw me but rarely spoke. I was somewhere in between the family and the staff, too involved with the children to be just another employee, but too invisible to be considered family. Catherine made sure I knew my place. "Don't get too attached," she warned me during my second week. "They're not your children, Margaret. Remember that." The words stung because they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to care for a child. You can't love someone halfway. You can't protect someone partially. When you commit to raising a child, even if they're not yours, you give everything, or you give nothing at all. The warning should have prepared me for what came later, but nothing could have readied me for the night that changed everything. The night when Richard Whitmore's older brother arrived without warning and saw something that his own flesh and blood had been blind to for almost 2 years. It was November 15th. I remember the exact date because it was the day before Emma's school play, and I had been helping her practice her lines for weeks. She was playing a tree in the school's production of The Seasons, and while other parents might have seen it as a small, silly role, to me it was Broadway. I had helped her make her costume from brown fabric and green construction paper leaves, staying up late after the other children were asleep to get every detail perfect. The weather had turned cold that week, the kind of November chill that creeps through even the best-heated Manhattan mansions and reminds you that winter is coming whether you're ready or not. I had spent the afternoon taking the children to Central Park, letting them run off their energy before dinner and homework. Emma had collected fallen leaves for a school project. Jake had found a perfect stick that he declared was a magic wand. Sophie had picked up smooth stones that she planned to paint later, and Matthew had toddled around, chasing pigeons and laughing with pure joy at their fluttering wings. Coming home to the mansion always felt like entering a different world, from the authentic warmth of children playing in the park to the cold perfection of marble floors and expensive art. But it was our world, at least for a little while longer, though I had no idea how little time we had left. That evening, I was in the laundry room folding the children's clothes, tiny sweaters and school uniforms, socks with holes that I mended because I couldn't bear to see them thrown away, pajamas soft from countless washings. The laundry room was in the basement, next to the wine cellar where Richard kept bottles worth more than I made in a year. I could hear the children upstairs getting ready for bed, their voices echoing through the mansion's high ceilings. I was holding one of Matthew's small shirts, blue with a dinosaur on the front that he had chosen himself, when I heard unfamiliar footsteps on the marble floors above, heavy, confident steps that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I paused, listening, as the footsteps moved through the house accompanied by Richard's voice and another man's deeper, warmer tone. "The children are upstairs getting ready for bed," I heard Richard say. "Margaret handles all that." Margaret. Not their nanny or the help or even Maggie, which is what the children called me. Just my full name. Spoken like I was a piece of furniture that happened to be useful for childcare duties. I finished folding Matthew's shirt and added it to the neat pile I was making. Each piece of clothing told a story. Grass stains from playing in the park, marker stains from art projects, chocolate smudges from stolen cookies. These weren't just clothes. They were evidence of childhood, proof that somewhere in this cold mansion, 4 little hearts were beating with joy and mischief and love. The footsteps moved toward the kitchen, and I heard the clink of glasses, the sound of expensive whiskey being poured. Richard was entertaining someone important. I could tell by the way his voice had taken on that false joviality he used when he wanted something from someone. "Business has been exceptional this quarter," Richard was saying. The tech stocks alone generated dividends worth $2.3 million, and our cryptocurrency portfolio has increased by 40% since June. The Bitcoin investments especially have been profitable beyond our projections. Numbers. Always numbers. Richard could tell you to the penny how much his assets were worth, how much his investment portfolio had grown, what his quarterly dividend income looked like. But ask him what Emma's favorite color was, or what Jake wanted to be when he grew up, and he would stare at you with blank confusion. I carried the folded laundry upstairs, moving quietly through the mansion's elegant rooms. The walls were covered with original paintings, Monet, Picasso, works of art worth millions of dollars. But there wasn't a single photograph of the family together. No evidence that children lived in this museum-like space, except for the artwork taped to the refrigerator in the kitchen. Sophie's drawings that I had convinced Catherine to display, though she complained they ruined the aesthetic of her designer kitchen. The children were in their bedrooms trying to delay bedtime as children do. I went to Matthew first, finding him in his dinosaur pajamas, sitting on his bed with a picture book about trucks. "Gaggy!" he squealed when he saw me, his face lighting up like sunshine. "Read story." I sat on his little bed and pulled him into my lap, feeling his warm weight against my chest. He smelled like baby shampoo and toothpaste and that indefinable sweetness that belongs only to children. As I read about bulldozers and dump trucks, his eyelids grew heavy, and he nestled deeper into my arms. This was my favorite time of day. Bedtime stories when the mansion was quiet and I had each child's complete attention. These were the moments when I felt like a real mother again, when the hollow space in my chest where Sarah used to live felt temporarily filled with borrowed love. Next was Sophie, who was sitting at her small desk drawing another picture. This one showed stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "It's you and us," she explained solemnly, pointing to each figure. "You're in the middle because you're the most important." My throat tightened with emotion. If only she knew how unimportant I was in the grand scheme of her family's life. If only she understood that I was just an employee who could be dismissed at any moment, whose love for them had no legal standing, no protection, no guarantee. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. "I'll treasure it always." Jake was next, supposed to be reading but actually building something complicated with Legos on his bedroom floor. "Look, Maggie," he said excitedly, "it's a space station for the aliens to live in so they don't have to be lonely anymore." The innocence of his words hit me like a physical blow. Even at 7 years old, Jake understood loneliness in a way that broke my heart. Did he see himself as one of those aliens living in a beautiful space station but fundamentally alone? "That's wonderful, Jake," I said, helping him put the Legos away. "The aliens are lucky to have you thinking about them." Finally, Emma was reading in bed, her blonde hair spread across her pillow like spun gold. She looked up when I came in, marking her place in the book with her finger. "Maggie, will you come to my play tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "I know Mommy and Daddy are busy, but I really want someone there who cares about me." The words pierced my heart. Someone who cares about me. As if her own parents didn't care. As if I was the only person in her world who saw her, who valued her, who thought she mattered. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," I promised, sitting on the edge of her bed. "You're going to be the most beautiful tree anyone has ever seen." She smiled then, a smile so bright it could have powered the mansion's elaborate lighting system. "I love you, Maggie," she whispered. "I love you too, darling," I whispered back, and meant it with every cell in my body. As I turned off her light and closed her door, I heard voices drifting up from the kitchen below. Richard was still entertaining his guest, their conversation a low murmur punctuated by occasional laughter. I should have gone to my room, my small, lonely room on the 4th floor where I would sit by the narrow window and write in my journal, recording the small moments that made my invisible life worthwhile. Instead, I found myself drawn to the back staircase, the servant stairs that the original builders had included so that help could move through the house without bothering the family. From the landing, I could hear the conversation more clearly. "You've built quite an empire here, Richard," the unfamiliar voice was saying. "The house alone must be worth what, 30 million?" "Closer to 40, Richard replied, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "We purchased it for 28 million 5 years ago. But with the renovations and the current real estate market, our property has appreciated significantly. Plus, the investment portfolio continues to generate substantial dividend income. Last quarter alone, our stock holdings paid out over $800,000 in dividends." "And Catherine? How is she handling motherhood?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Ice clinked in glasses. Someone cleared their throat. "Catherine has her own interests," Richard finally said. "Charity work, social obligations. The children are well cared for." "By the nanny?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Margaret is adequate," Richard said, and the dismissive tone in his voice made my hands clench into fists. "She's been with us about 18 months. Good with the children, reliable. They seem attached to her." Attached. As if love was some kind of inconvenience, something messy and complicated that interfered with the clean lines of their perfectly ordered life. 18 months? The other voice said, and there was something different in his tone now. Surprise, maybe, or concern. "That's quite a while in this family. Most nannies don't last 6 months. Well, the children do seem fond of her." Fond. As if Jake's gap-toothed grins were merely fondness, as if Sophie's daily drawings were just fondness, as if Emma's whispered confidences about school and friends and dreams were simply fondness, as if Matthew's sleepy cuddles during bedtime stories were nothing more than fondness. I had heard enough. I turned to go back to my room, but my foot caught on the edge of the step, and I stumbled slightly. The sound echoed in the stairwell, just a small noise but enough to pause the conversation below. "What was that?" the unfamiliar voice asked. "Probably Margaret," Richard said dismissively. "She's always moving around, taking care of something or other." Always moving around, taking care of something or other. 18 months of my life reduced to that casual, thoughtless description. 18 months of loving his children, protecting them, nurturing them, being the stable presence in their lives while he counted his millions and Catherine planned her social calendar. I made it to my room and closed the door quietly, leaning against it as tears I had been holding back for months finally spilled over. My small room felt smaller than ever. A twin bed with a faded comforter, a dresser with a mirror that reflected my tired face, a chair where I kept the few personal belongings I had brought with me. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph of my Sarah, taken 2 weeks before she died, her smile radiant as she held a bouquet of dandelions she had picked for me. 25 years had passed since I lost her, but the grief was still there, buried deep, but never gone. That's why loving the Whitmore children hurt so much, because I knew how precious and fragile life was, how quickly everything you loved could disappear. Every day I spent with Emma, Jake, Sophie, and Matthew felt like borrowing against a debt I could never repay. I sat in my chair by the narrow window, looking out over the service alley where delivery trucks unloaded groceries and supplies for the mansion. From this window, I couldn't see Central Park or the city skyline that the family enjoyed from their rooms. I saw dumpsters and fire escapes, the unglamorous backside of wealth and privilege. But I also saw truth from this window. I saw the delivery drivers who worked long hours for modest pay. I saw the maintenance workers who kept the building running smoothly. I saw Mrs. Chen from the apartment building across the alley, hanging laundry on her fire escape because she couldn't afford a dryer. Real people living real lives, not the artificial perfection of the Whitmore world. I pulled out my journal, a simple notebook where I recorded the children's milestones, their funny sayings, their small triumphs and fears. Tomorrow, Emma would perform in her school play, and I would be there cheering for her. Next week, Jake had a math test he was worried about, and I would help him study at the kitchen counter. Sophie was learning to write her name in cursive, and Matthew was finally sleeping through the night without nightmares. These were the moments that mattered, the memories that money couldn't buy. Richard's vast fortune, his stock portfolios worth hundreds of millions, his monthly dividend income that exceeded most people's annual salaries. None of that could purchase what I gave his children freely: attention, patience, unconditional love. As I wrote in my journal, I heard the front door close and a car engine start in the driveway. Richard's guest was leaving, returning to whatever life awaited him outside this marble mausoleum. I wondered what he had thought of this place, of Richard's casual dismissal of his children's emotional needs, of a family so wealthy they could buy anything except genuine connection. I was about to close my journal when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, not the confident stride of Richard or the click of Catherine's heels against marble. These were different footsteps, slower, more thoughtful. They paused outside my door, and for a moment I held my breath, wondering if someone was about to knock. But the footsteps continued down the hall, and I heard the elevator door close as someone went up to the family's private floor. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath without knowing why. The next morning brought Emma's school play, and I woke early to help her get ready. She was nervous standing in front of her bedroom mirror in the tree costume we had made together, her face pale with stage fright. "What if I forget my lines?" she worried, twisting the hem of her brown dress. "You won't forget," I assured her, kneeling down to adjust her costume. "And even if you do, I'll be right there in the audience and I'll help you remember. We're a team, Emma. Always." Her smile was radiant, transforming her worried face into pure sunshine. "You'll really be there." I promised, didn't I? And I never break my promises to you. Catherine had already left for a morning charity committee meeting, and Richard was in his study on a conference call with investors discussing quarterly earnings reports and market projections. Neither of them mentioned the school play, though it had been marked on the family calendar for 3 weeks. I walked Emma to school, holding her small hand as we navigated the busy Manhattan sidewalks. The private academy she attended was housed in a beautiful brownstone building on the Upper West Side, with ivy-covered walls and brass nameplate that spoke of old money and older traditions. The tuition alone cost more than most families earned in a year, but the education was exceptional, and the teachers genuinely cared about their students. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, greeted us at the door with a warm smile. "Good morning, Emma. Are you excited about the play?" Emma nodded, suddenly shy, pressing closer to my side. "And you must be Margaret," Mrs. Patterson said, extending her hand to me. "Emma talks about you all the time. Thank you for coming to support her." The warmth in the teacher's voice was genuine, and I felt a rush of gratitude that someone else recognized the importance of showing up for a child. "I wouldn't miss it," I said, squeezing Emma's hand. "She's worked so hard on her lines." As we walked toward Emma's classroom, I noticed other parents dropping off their children. Mothers and fathers who hugged their kids goodbye, who asked about homework and weekend plans, who were actively engaged in their children's lives. The contrast with the Whitmore family was stark and painful. The school play was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon, which gave me time to go home and take Jake and Sophie to the park while Matthew napped. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of roasted chestnuts from street vendors. Central Park was dressed in its fall colors, gold and crimson and burnt orange, like nature's own masterpiece painted across the urban landscape. Jake immediately ran to the playground, his energy boundless as always. Sophie found a patch of grass where she could collect more leaves for her art projects. I pushed Matthew in his stroller along the winding paths, pointing out squirrels and birds, singing him quiet songs that made him clap his hands with delight. These were the moments I treasured most. when it was just the four of us in our own little world, away from the mansion's cold perfection and their parents' emotional distance. In the park, I could pretend they were mine, at least for a little while. I could be the mother I had always wanted to be again, the mother Sarah's death had forced me to stop being. "Maggie, look!" Sophie called, running toward me with her arms full of colorful leaves. "I found the perfect ones for my picture." Her face was flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with the simple joy of discovery. This was childhood as it should be, full of wonder and possibility, unmarked by the loneliness that shadowed their lives at home. We returned to the mansion for lunch, and I settled the children with sandwiches and fruit while I prepared for Emma's play. I had pressed my best dress, a simple navy blue that I had owned for 5 years, but still looked presentable. I wanted to look nice for Emma's special day, to be someone she could be proud to have in the audience. At 1:30, I walked back to the school, my heart full of anticipation for Emma's moment in the spotlight. The auditorium was small but lovely, with wooden floors and tall windows that let in the afternoon sunlight. Parents filled the chairs, many of them holding cameras and phones to record their children's performances. I found a seat near the front and looked around for any sign of Catherine or Richard. Perhaps they had changed their minds. Perhaps they had rearranged their schedules to attend their daughter's first school play. But as the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, I realized I was the only one there for Emma. The play was charming in the way that only children's theater can be, earnest and sweet and utterly sincere. Emma stood tall and proud as her tree, delivering her lines with perfect clarity and confidence. When she spotted me in the audience, her face lit up with pure joy, and she gave me a little wave that wasn't part of the script, but was absolutely perfect. I clapped until my hands hurt, cheering louder than any other parent in that auditorium. Emma was magnificent, radiant, and I was so proud of her I could barely contain the emotion swelling in my chest. This was what parenting was supposed to feel like, being present for the moments that mattered, celebrating the small victories, showing up with love and pride and unwavering support. After the play, Emma ran to me with her arms wide, still wearing her tree costume. "Did you see me, Maggie? Did I do good?" "You were perfect," I told her, lifting her in my arms despite the protest from my aging back. "Absolutely perfect. I'm so proud of you I could burst." She hugged me tightly, and in that moment nothing else mattered. Not Richard's dismissive attitude, or Catherine's emotional absence, or my own financial struggles, or the uncertainty of my position in their household. Nothing mattered except this little girl in my arms who had performed her heart out and wanted nothing more than someone who loved her to say she had done well. We walked home together through the Manhattan streets, Emma chattering excitedly about the play and her friends and how the costume had felt under the hot stage lights. I listened to every word, storing each detail in my memory like precious treasure. When we arrived at the mansion, Catherine was in the kitchen, elegant in her afternoon outfit, checking messages on her phone. She looked up when we entered, and I expected her to ask about the play, to want to hear about Emma's performance. Instead, she barely glanced at us. "Oh, you're back," she said absently, then returned to her phone. Emma's excitement dimmed slightly. "Mommy, I was a tree in the play today. I remembered all my lines." "That's nice, dear," Catherine replied without looking up. "Margaret, the children need to be quiet this evening. Richard's having an important business dinner here, and they can't be running around." An important business dinner, more critical than their daughter's first school play, more urgent than celebrating a 9-year-old's accomplishment. I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and fierce, but I swallowed it down as I had learned to do. "Of course," I said quietly. "We'll be very quiet." That evening, as I helped the children with their baths and bedtime routines, Emma was subdued. The joy from her successful performance had been dampened by her mother's indifference, and it broke my heart to see her small shoulders slumped with disappointment. "Mommy didn't ask to see my costume," she said quietly as I brushed her hair. "Some people show love differently," I told her, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. Your mother loves you very much, even if she doesn't always know how to show it." But Emma was 9 years old and wise enough to recognize the difference between love and indifference. "She forgot about my play," she said simply. I had no answer for that, no way to explain or excuse such fundamental parental failure. Instead, I held her close and told her again how proud I was, how beautiful and talented and special she was. But I knew my words couldn't completely heal the wound her mother's neglect had opened. Downstairs, I could hear the sounds of Richard's business dinner, voices discussing market trends, investment opportunities, the latest fluctuations in cryptocurrency values, Bitcoin prices, stock dividends, portfolio diversification, the language of wealth and power that meant more to them than their children's emotional needs. As I put the children to bed that night, each one hugged me a little tighter, held on a little longer. Did they sense something changing? Children are often more perceptive than adults give them credit for. Perhaps they felt the shift in the household's energy, the subtle tension that had been building over the past few weeks. I was just closing Matthew's door when I heard footsteps on the main staircase. Not the familiar sounds of the family, but the heavier tread of someone unfamiliar. Richard's dinner guest was apparently staying late, or there was more than one visitor. I thought about going to my room, avoiding any chance encounter with strangers who might look right through me as if I were invisible. But something made me hesitate at the top of the back stairs, some instinct I couldn't quite name. Through the ornate railing, I could see part of the main foyer, with its marble floors and crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's cars. I heard voices approaching, Richard's familiar tone and another man's voice, deeper and warmer than Richard's. "She's been with us over a year now," Richard was saying. "The children are attached to her." There was that word again, attached. As if love was some kind of inconvenience, some messy complication that interfered with the perfect order of their lives. 18 months, the other voice corrected gently, and from what I observed this evening, she's more than just attached to them. She's raising them. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had been watching me, observing how I interacted with the children, but who and why? "Well, Catherine and I are very busy," Richard said defensively. "The portfolio requires constant attention, especially with the volatility in the cryptocurrency markets. Our Bitcoin holdings alone require daily monitoring, and Catherine has her charity commitments." "I'm sure she does," the other voice replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely impressed by Catherine's charity work. But what about the children's emotional needs? What about being present for their milestones? A long silence followed. I pressed closer to the railing, straining to hear Richard's response. "They're well cared for," he finally said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Margaret sees to all their needs." "Does she?" the other voice asked quietly. "Because from what I saw today, she's doing far more than just meeting their needs. She's loving them. She's raising them. She's being the parent they need while you're busy managing your vast fortune." The words hit like physical blows, each one landing squarely on truths I had been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. Someone had seen the reality of our situation, the emotional distance of the parents, the children's hunger for love and attention, my role as surrogate mother in a house where actual parenting was an afterthought. "Now see here, David," Richard began, his voice rising defensively. David. So that was the visitor's name. I wondered who he was. What gave him the authority to challenge Richard about his parenting? Few people had the courage or standing to confront a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars about his personal life. "No, you see here," David interrupted, and his voice carried a strength that made Richard fall silent. "Those children upstairs are growing up without parents. They have a nanny who loves them more than life itself, and parents who treat them like expensive accessories. Do you have any idea what that's doing to them?" My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it echoing in the stairwell. Someone was finally speaking the truth about this family, finally naming the emotional neglect that I had witnessed every day for 18 months. "You're being dramatic," Richard said, but his voice lacked its usual confident authority. "The children are fine. They have everything they need." "Everything money can buy," David agreed. "But what about the things money can't purchase? What about feeling valued, cherished, prioritized? When was the last time you attended one of their school events? When was the last time you read them a bedtime story, or helped with homework, or just sat with them when they were scared?" Silence. Long, heavy, damning silence. "That's what I thought," David continued quietly. "You're so busy building your financial empire that you've forgotten to build relationships with your own children. And that woman upstairs, Margaret, she's doing the job you should be doing. She's loving them while you count your money." I had to cover my mouth with my hand to keep from making any sound. Tears were streaming down my face. Tears of validation, of recognition, of grief for everything these children were missing. Someone finally saw the truth. Someone finally understood. "I provide for them," Richard said weakly. "They attend the best schools, wear the finest clothes, live in one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses. Their trust funds alone are worth more than—" "Stop," David interrupted. "Just stop. You're talking about money again. I'm talking about love. I'm talking about presence. I'm talking about being a father instead of just a provider." I heard footsteps moving toward the front door, and I realized the conversation was ending. Quietly, carefully, I backed away from the railing and made my way to my room, my heart still pounding with the shock of overhearing such brutal honesty about the family I worked for. In my small room, I sat on my bed and tried to process what I had heard. Someone named David, apparently someone close enough to Richard to speak so bluntly, had seen through the mansion's elegant facade to the emotional poverty beneath. He had recognized what I had been living with every day, children starving for parental love while their actual parents pursued wealth and status. But more than that, he had seen me. He had witnessed my love for these children, my role in their lives, the fact that I was raising them in every way that mattered. For 18 months, I had been invisible to almost everyone in this household. Tonight, for the first time, someone had truly seen me. I pulled out my journal and began to write, trying to capture not just the events of the day, but the emotions swirling through me. Emma's triumph at the school play, her mother's devastating indifference, the mysterious David's confrontation with Richard about parental neglect. The words poured out of me, 18 months of observations and heartbreak and fierce protective love for 4 children who deserved so much better than they were getting. As I wrote, I found myself wondering about David. Who was he? What was his connection to this family? And why had he been watching me interact with the children? His words suggested he had spent time observing our household dynamics, noting the emotional gaps, recognizing the role I played in filling them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments of joy and heartbreak in my invisible life as the woman who loved these children more than their own parents did. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with possibility and change. Someone had spoken truth to power, had challenged Richard's convenient blindness to his children's needs. I fell asleep clutching my journal, surrounded by the artwork Sophie had given me and the small treasures the children had shared. In my dreams, I saw Emma on stage, radiant in her tree costume, performing her heart out for an audience that included not just me, but parents who cheered with pride, who celebrated their daughter's accomplishments, who made her feel like the center of their world instead of an afterthought in their busy lives. The next morning brought an unusual energy to the mansion. Catherine was quieter than usual during breakfast, picking at her grapefruit while scrolling through messages on her phone with less than her usual focus. Richard didn't appear at all, which was unusual. Typically, he would at least make an appearance in the kitchen for coffee before disappearing into his study to monitor his investments. The children sensed the difference in atmosphere, talking more quietly than usual, sharing uncertain glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Emma kept watching the kitchen doorway as if expecting someone to appear, and Jake kept asking if everything was okay. "Everything's fine, darling," I assured him, ruffling his hair as I packed his lunch. "Just a quiet morning." But it wasn't fine, and I suspected we were all about to discover just how not fine things had become. There was a tension in the air, a sense of impending change that made my stomach flutter with anxiety. After 18 months of routine, something significant was shifting in the Whitmore household. I walked the children to school as usual, but Emma was subdued, clearly still hurt by her mother's indifference to the school play. As we approached the academy's brownstone building, she slipped her hand into mine. "Maggie," she said quietly, "will you always be here?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Children have an uncanny ability to sense when the adults in their lives are feeling uncertain, when change is lurking just around the corner. Emma's question revealed that she was feeling the same tension I was experiencing, the same foreboding that something in our carefully ordered world was about to shift. "I'm here now," I told her, which was the only honest answer I could give. "And I love you very much." She squeezed my hand tighter. "I love you too, Maggie, more than anyone." After dropping the children at school, I returned to the mansion to find Catherine waiting for me in the kitchen. She was dressed in one of her designer suits, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. But there was something different about her expression, a wariness, a hint of defensiveness that I had never seen before. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. My stomach dropped. In my experience, conversations that began with those 4 words rarely ended well for people in my position. I sat across from her at the kitchen island, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from trembling. "Richard had an interesting conversation with his brother last night," Catherine began, her voice carefully neutral. "David seems to have some opinions about our household arrangements." Richard's brother. That explained the familiarity in David's voice, the authority with which he had challenged Richard about his parenting. It also explained why Richard had listened to the criticism instead of simply dismissing it. "I see," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was seeing beyond the fact that my eavesdropping the previous evening was about to have consequences. Catherine studied me for a long moment, her blue eyes assessing. "David seems to think you're overstepping your boundaries with the children. He's concerned that they're becoming too attached to you." There was that word again, but this time it felt like an accusation. Attached, as if loving these children was some kind of professional failing, some boundary violation that needed to be corrected. "I care for them as you've asked me to," I said carefully, "but perhaps too much," Catherine replied. "The children should be learning to rely on their family, not on temporary caregivers." Temporary caregivers. After 18 months of sleepless nights, playground visits, homework help, bedtime stories, and unconditional love, I was being reduced to a temporary caregiver. The dismissiveness in her tone made my chest tighten with hurt and anger. "Is there something specific you'd like me to do differently?" I asked, proud that my voice remained steady despite the turmoil inside me. Catherine hesitated, and I could see her weighing her words carefully. "We've decided it would be best if you began stepping back from some of your duties. The children need to become more independent, less reliant on your constant presence." My heart started pounding. This was the beginning of the end. I could feel it as surely as I could feel the October morning chill seeping through the mansion's windows. They were preparing to let me go, couching it in language about independence and healthy boundaries. But the message was clear. My love for these children had become inconvenient. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "No more bedtime stories," Catherine said, ticking off items on her manicured fingers. "No more helping with homework, no more special outings to the park. The children need to learn that you're here to supervise, not to mother them. Each restriction felt like a knife to the heart. No more bedtime stories meant no more of Matthew's sleepy cuddles, no more chances to ease Emma's nighttime anxieties, no more opportunities to help Jake process his day. No more homework help meant watching Emma struggle with reading without being able to assist. No more park outings meant no more of those precious moments when we felt like a real family. And what about when they're sick? I asked. Or frightened? Or just need comfort? Catherine's expression hardened slightly. They have parents for that. The irony was breathtaking. Parents who were never available when their children needed them, who missed school plays and forgot about scraped knees and treated bedtime as someone else's responsibility. Parents who could quote their investment portfolio's current value to the penny, but couldn't name their youngest child's favorite toy. Of course, I said quietly. David will be staying with us for a few weeks, Catherine continued, and I heard the underlying warning in her voice. He's expressed interest in getting to know the children better. I'm sure you understand that family time should be private. So that was it. Richard's brother had criticized their parenting, and instead of examining their own failures, they were restricting my access to the children. It was easier to blame the nanny for overstepping than to acknowledge that the children seeking love and comfort from me was a direct result of not receiving it from their actual parents. I understand, I said, though understanding and agreeing were two very different things. That afternoon, when I picked up the children from school, Emma immediately sensed something was wrong. "You look sad, Maggie," she said, taking my hand as we walked toward home. How could I explain to a 9-year-old that loving her too much had apparently become my professional failing? How could I tell her that our bedtime stories were ending, not because she had outgrown them, but because someone had decided our bond was inappropriate? "Just a quiet day," I told her, forcing a smile. But Emma was too perceptive to be fooled by false cheer. "Are you in trouble?" she asked quietly. The question broke something inside me. Was I in trouble? Was loving these children, caring for them, being present in their lives really so wrong? Had I somehow failed by giving them what their parents wouldn't? Attention, affection, genuine interest in their daily lives? "No, sweetheart," I said, though I was no longer certain that was true. "I'm not in trouble." When we arrived at the mansion, I was introduced to David Whitmore, Richard's older brother who was apparently staying in one of the guest rooms during his visit to New York. He was taller than Richard, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. When he shook my hand, his grip was warm and firm. "You must be Margaret," he said. "I've heard so much about you." There was something in his tone that suggested he had heard more than just the official version of my role in the household. Perhaps he was the one who had been observing me with the children, noting the emotional dynamics that Richard and Catherine preferred to ignore. "It's nice to meet you," I replied, wondering how much of last night's conversation he remembered and whether he realized I had overheard some of it. "Uncle David!" Emma exclaimed, running to hug him. "Are you staying for dinner?" "I am, indeed," he said, scooping her up for a proper hug. "I'm hoping to spend lots of time with you and your brothers and sister while I'm here." The children were delighted by this unexpected addition to their routine. Jake immediately began telling David about his Lego space station. Sophie produced her latest artwork for his admiration, and Matthew shyly offered to share his favorite dinosaur book. David listened to each child with genuine attention, asking questions, showing real interest in their answers. Watching him interact with them was both wonderful and heartbreaking. This was what parental attention looked like: focused, engaged, genuinely curious about the children's thoughts and feelings. David managed to give each child individual attention while somehow including all of them in the conversation. It was a master class in family interaction that his brother and sister-in-law could have learned from, but it also highlighted everything the children had been missing: Emma practically glowed under David's attention. Jake became more animated than I had seen him in weeks, and Sophie kept bringing him new drawings as if she couldn't bear for his focus to shift to anything else. They were starved for this kind of engaged adult interaction, and David's presence made their emotional hunger painfully obvious. During dinner, which I served but was not invited to join, I could hear the children chattering excitedly, their voices bright with joy. David asked about school, about friends, about their interests and hobbies. He laughed at Jake's jokes and praised Sophie's artwork and listened seriously to Emma's opinions about books she was reading. From the kitchen, where I ate my own meal in solitude, I felt a mixture of gratitude and grief. Gratitude that these children were finally receiving the attention they deserved. Grief that it took a visiting uncle to provide what their parents should have been giving them all along. After dinner, as I was cleaning up, David appeared in the kitchen. "Can I help?" he offered, picking up a dish towel. "That's not necessary," I said quickly. "I can manage." "I know you can," he replied, beginning to dry the dishes I had washed. "But that doesn't mean you should have to do everything alone." We worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, and I found myself stealing glances at this man who had somehow seen through the mansion's elegant facade to the emotional reality beneath. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, someone who didn't need to assert his importance through wealth or status. "The children are wonderful," he said eventually. "They are," I agreed, unable to keep the warmth out of my voice. "And they clearly adore you." I didn't know how to respond to that. Was he complimenting me or criticizing me? Was this more evidence of the inappropriate attachment Catherine had mentioned? "I care for them very much," I said carefully. David set down the dish he had been drying and turned to face me fully. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" I nodded, though my stomach was already tensing with anticipation. "How long has it been since Richard or Catherine put the children to bed?" The question was so unexpected that I answered honestly before I could think better of it. "I don't think they ever have, not since I've been here." "And school events? Parent-teacher conferences?" "I attend those," I said quietly. "What about when the children are sick, or scared, or just need comfort?" "They come to me." David nodded slowly, as if my answers confirmed something he had already suspected. "And you love them." It wasn't a question, so I didn't try to pretend otherwise. "Yes, I love them very much." "That's what I thought," he said gently. "Anyone with eyes can see it. The way you look at them, the way they gravitate toward you, the way you anticipate their needs. It's clear you've become their emotional anchor in this house." I waited for the criticism, for the warning about boundaries and appropriate professional distance. Instead, David surprised me. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For loving them when no one else would, for giving them what they need most. Not money or fancy clothes or expensive toys, but genuine care and attention, for being present in their lives when their actual parents are too busy building their fortune to notice their children growing up." Tears sprang to my eyes before I could stop them. For 18 months, I had wondered if I was overstepping, if I was too involved, if my love for these children was somehow inappropriate or unprofessional. To hear someone acknowledge that love as valuable, as necessary, as something worthy of gratitude rather than criticism, it was overwhelming. "They're easy to love," I managed to say. "Not for everyone, apparently," David replied with a sad smile. "But for you, yes, it's written all over your face every time you look at them." That night, as I tucked the children into bed, perhaps for one of the last times if Catherine's restrictions took full effect, each one seemed to sense that something was changing. Emma held onto my hand a little longer than usual. Jake asked twice if I would still be there when he woke up. Sophie made me promise to hang her latest drawing on my bedroom wall. And Matthew, sweet little Matthew, wouldn't let go when I tried to put him down in his crib. "Gaggy, stay," he whimpered, his small arms wrapped around my neck. "I have to go to my room now," I told him gently. "But I'll see you in the morning." Promise. The word was a knife to my heart. How could I promise anything when I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet, when I sensed that my time in this house was running out? "I promise I'll always love you," I said instead, which was the only promise I was certain I could keep. As I closed Matthew's door and headed toward my room, I nearly collided with David in the hallway. He was coming from the direction of Richard's study, and his expression was troubled. "Margaret," he said quietly, "could we talk?" My heart started pounding again. First Catherine this morning, now David this evening. I was beginning to feel like a defendant awaiting judgment from a jury I couldn't see. "Of course," I said. He glanced toward Richard's study, then back at me. "Perhaps we could sit on the back terrace? It's private there." The October evening was cool but not uncomfortable, and the terrace overlooked the mansion's small garden, a carefully manicured space that the children were rarely allowed to play in for fear of disturbing Catherine's prized landscaping. We sat on wrought iron chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, surrounded by the soft glow of solar lighting that illuminated perfectly arranged topiaries and flower beds. "I had a conversation with Richard this evening," David began without preamble, "about the children, about you, about the dynamics in this household." I waited, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from trembling. "He's planning to let you go," David said gently. "Not immediately, but soon, within the next few weeks. He intends to find your replacement and transition the children to someone who will maintain more professional boundaries." The words hit me like physical blows, even though I had been expecting them. Hearing it stated so directly, so matter-of-factly, made the inevitable feel suddenly urgent and real. "I see," I managed to say. "Do you?" David asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Because I'm not sure Richard sees anything at all. He's so concerned about the children being too attached to you that he's completely blind to why that attachment exists in the first place." I looked out over the garden, trying to process what he was telling me. Within weeks, I would be leaving this house, leaving these children, leaving the only family I had known for the past 18 months. Emma would lose the one person who attended her school events. Jake would lose his homework helper and playground companion. Sophie would lose her most enthusiastic audience for her artwork. And Matthew, precious Matthew, would lose the only mother figure he had ever really known. "They'll be devastated," I said quietly. "They will," David agreed, "and Richard and Catherine will be completely unprepared to deal with that devastation. They have no idea how much these children depend on you, how much you mean to them, because they've never bothered to pay attention to their own children's emotional needs." The anger in his voice was restrained, but unmistakable. Clearly, his conversation with Richard hadn't gone well. "Is there nothing that can be done?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. People like the Whitmores didn't change their minds once they had made a decision, especially when that decision allowed them to avoid uncomfortable truths about their own failings. "I tried," David said. "I tried to make Richard understand what he'll be doing to these children, what kind of trauma he'll be inflicting by removing the one stable, loving presence in their lives. But he's convinced himself that you're the problem, that the children's attachment to you is somehow unhealthy." "Maybe it is," I said, voicing the fear that had been growing in my heart. "Maybe I have overstepped. Maybe I've made it too easy for them to avoid parenting their own children." David turned to face me fully, his expression intense. "Margaret, listen to me carefully. You have not overstepped. You have not done anything wrong. You have loved children who desperately needed love. And you have given them stability and care when their own parents failed to provide it. The problem is not that you love them too much. The problem is that Richard and Catherine love them too little." His words were fierce, passionate, and they reached something deep inside me that had been wounded by Catherine's criticisms and Richard's dismissive attitude. For 18 months, I had second-guessed myself, wondered if I was too involved, worried that my love for these children was somehow inappropriate or unprofessional. But if loving them costs me my job, costs me the chance to be in their lives at all, I began. Then the system is broken, David interrupted. Not you, not your love. The system that values money over relationships, that treats children like accessories rather than human beings with emotional needs. That punishes caregivers for caring too much rather than parents for caring too little. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between us. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of Manhattan evening. Traffic, sirens, the constant hum of a city that never sleeps. But here in the garden, surrounded by the evidence of wealth and privilege, it felt like we were in a different world entirely. What will happen to them? I asked finally. David sighed deeply. Richard will hire another nanny. Someone older, more distant, someone who will maintain professional boundaries and treat the children like a job rather than a calling. The children will learn not to expect emotional connection from their caregivers. They'll become more self-reliant, more independent, just as Catherine wants. And more emotionally damaged, I added quietly. Almost certainly, David agreed. But Richard and Catherine will see it as growth, as healthy development. They'll congratulate themselves on correcting what they perceive as an unhealthy dependency. The future he was describing filled me with despair. These 4 wonderful children, already starved for parental love, would learn that even surrogate love was temporary and unreliable. They would build walls around their hearts to protect themselves from future abandonment. They would grow up wealthy but emotionally impoverished, just like their parents. There has to be something, I said desperately, some way to help them understand what they're doing to their own children. David was quiet for a long time, staring out over the garden as if the perfectly arranged landscape might hold answers to an impossible situation. There might be, he said finally, his voice thoughtful, but it would require Richard to see something he's been determined not to see for years. It would require him to acknowledge that his children's emotional needs are more important than his comfort zone. What do you mean? David turned to me with an expression that was part hope, part determination, and part something I couldn't quite identify. How would you feel about forcing his hand? He asked quietly. The next morning brought an unusual energy to the household. David was up early, making breakfast for the children, an unprecedented event that had them gathered around the kitchen island with expressions of delighted shock. He moved with surprising competence, flipping pancakes and pouring orange juice while asking about their plans for the day. "This is the best breakfast ever," Jake declared, his mouth full of pancakes that were admittedly perfect, golden brown and fluffy, in a way that suggested David had more domestic skills than his wealthy lifestyle might have indicated. "Can you make breakfast every day?" Sophie asked hopefully. "We'll see," David replied with a smile, catching my eye with an expression that suggested he had plans I wasn't yet aware of. Catherine appeared in the kitchen dressed for another day of charity obligations, her expression mildly annoyed at finding her perfectly ordered routine disrupted by her brother-in-law's domestic initiatives. "David, you don't need to," she began. "I wanted to," he interrupted smoothly. "I don't get to spend enough time with my nieces and nephew. This seemed like a good way to start the day." Richard was nowhere to be seen, and when I asked about his absence, David mentioned that he had left early for a meeting with his investment advisors about restructuring part of his portfolio. Even when his brother was visiting, Richard's financial empire took priority over family time. As I walked the children to school, Emma skipped beside me with unusual energy. "Uncle David is so much fun," she said. "He listened to all my stories about school, and he said he wants to hear about my next play if I get another part." The contrast with her parents' indifference was stark and painful. One morning of genuine attention from an adult who cared about her thoughts and feelings had transformed Emma's entire demeanor. She was brighter, more confident, walking taller, as if someone's interest in her life had inflated her sense of self-worth. Jake was equally animated, chattering about how Uncle David had asked to see his Lego space station and had actually understood the complicated backstory Jake had created for the alien inhabitants. He didn't just pretend to listen like... Jake paused, apparently realizing he was about to criticize his parents. "Like what, sweetheart?" I prompted gently. "Like some grown-ups do," Jake finished diplomatically. But I heard what he hadn't said. His parents pretended to listen when they bothered to acknowledge his interests at all. But David had engaged with genuine curiosity and enthusiasm. Even Matthew seemed affected by the change in household dynamics. He had been more talkative than usual during breakfast, chattering in his toddler language while David listened with apparent fascination and responded as if Matthew's observations were the most interesting things he had ever heard. After dropping the children at school, I returned to find the mansion in something approaching chaos. Catherine was in the kitchen, her usual composure cracked, speaking sharply into her phone while David sat calmly at the breakfast table, reading the newspaper as if nothing unusual was happening. "Completely unacceptable," Catherine was saying. "I don't care what the circumstances are. This level of disruption to our routine is... Yes, I understand, but no, that's not going to work." She ended the call with obvious frustration and turned to glare at David, who continued reading as if he hadn't noticed her distress. "Problem?" he asked mildly, not looking up from his paper. "You know exactly what the problem is," Catherine snapped. "Mrs. Henderson has been the children's piano teacher for 3 years, and now suddenly she's not available for their lessons? And the same day that their tennis instructor calls to cancel and their French tutor has a family emergency?" David folded his newspaper carefully and looked at Catherine with an expression of polite concern. "How unfortunate. What are you going to do?" "What am I going to do?" Catherine's voice rose slightly. "The children have specific schedules, specific obligations. These lessons are important for their development." "Are they?" David asked quietly. "Or are they important for your social status?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I suddenly realized what was happening. Somehow, David had orchestrated the cancellation of all the children's afternoon activities, the structured, expensive lessons that filled their time but did nothing to address their emotional needs. Catherine's face flushed with anger. "Their education is extremely important to Richard and me." "Their education, yes," David agreed. "But what about their childhood? When was the last time they had an afternoon just to play? When was the last time they spent unstructured time with their parents? We provide them with the finest instructors, the best possible." "You provide them with distractions," David interrupted. "Piano lessons and tennis lessons and French tutors are wonderful supplements to family life, but they're not substitutes for parental attention." Catherine looked ready to explode, but before she could respond, David's phone buzzed. He answered it with a casual, "Hello?" then listened for a moment before saying, "Yes, that's correct. Thank you for confirming." He ended the call and looked at Catherine with an expression I was beginning to recognize, calm on the surface but with steel underneath. "That was Richard's office," he said conversationally. "It seems there's been an issue with some of his investment accounts. Nothing serious, but it requires his immediate attention for the next several hours." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "What kind of issue?" "Technical problems with the trading platform, I believe. Something about cryptocurrency transactions that need manual verification. Very time-consuming, apparently." I watched this exchange with growing amazement. David was systematically dismantling the Whitmore family's carefully constructed avoidance of parental responsibility. He had eliminated the children's afternoon activities and created a crisis that would keep Richard occupied, leaving Catherine with something she hadn't faced in years: an afternoon alone with her own children, with no structured activities to hide behind. "I have commitments," Catherine said desperately. "The museum board meeting is this afternoon, and the charity luncheon planning committee—" "Yes, about that," David said, consulting his phone again. "I took the liberty of checking your calendar this morning. It seems there's been some confusion about scheduling. The museum meeting has been moved to next week, and the charity committee had to cancel due to a double booking at the venue." Catherine stared at him with something approaching horror. "That's impossible. I confirmed both appointments yesterday." "Schedules change," David said with a shrug. "It happens." Of course, it didn't just happen. David had clearly orchestrated this entire situation, creating circumstances that would force Catherine to spend uninterrupted time with her children for perhaps the first time in years. The question was whether she would recognize the opportunity or find new ways to avoid genuine engagement with Emma, Jake, Sophie, and Matthew. "This is ridiculous," Catherine muttered, but her phone was already ringing again. She answered it with obvious irritation, listened for a moment, then said, "What do you mean, postponed?" "I've had this appointment scheduled for weeks." While Catherine argued with whoever was on the other end of the line, David caught my eye and gave me a slight nod. Whatever he had planned, Phase 1 was clearly in motion. The children returned from school to find their familiar afternoon routine completely disrupted. No piano teacher waiting in the music room, no tennis instructor ready to drive them to the country club, no French tutor prepared to drill them on vocabulary and pronunciation. Instead, they found their mother standing in the kitchen, looking slightly panic-stricken, and their Uncle David wearing an expression of innocent helpfulness. "What's happening?" Emma asked, sensing the unusual energy in the house. "Well," David said, "it seems like you have a free afternoon. What would you like to do?" The question was so foreign to their structured existence that the children looked genuinely confused. When was the last time anyone had asked what they wanted to do instead of telling them where they needed to be? "Can we play in the park?" Jake asked hopefully. "I don't think—" Catherine began, but David interrupted her. "The park sounds perfect," he said. "Who wants to go to Central Park and just play?" All 4 children raised their hands enthusiastically, and I felt my heart swell with love and sadness. Such a simple pleasure. An afternoon in the park without schedules or lessons or structured activities. And they were as excited as if David had offered to take them to Disneyland. "Margaret will take them," Catherine said quickly, clearly looking for a way to escape the unstructured family time David was proposing. "Actually," David said smoothly, "I was hoping you might come with us, Catherine. When was the last time you played in the park with your children?" Catherine's face went pale. She looked like someone who had been asked to perform brain surgery without anesthesia, terrified, overwhelmed, and desperately searching for an escape route. I don't really—" she stammered. "It's just playing," David said gently. "Pushing swings, watching them climb on playground equipment, maybe tossing a ball around. Nothing complicated." But for Catherine, it was apparently the most complicated thing in the world. She had built her entire identity around being the perfectly dressed, perfectly organized society wife, who attended the right charity events and served on the correct boards. The thought of getting grass stains on her designer clothes while engaging in unstructured play with her children was clearly outside her comfort zone entirely. "I suppose I could—" she began reluctantly. "Wonderful," David said before she could change her mind. "Emma, Jake, Sophie, Matthew, go get your jackets. We're going to have an adventure." As the children raced upstairs to get ready, Catherine turned to me with something approaching desperation. "Margaret, you'll come too, won't you? In case something—" She couldn't even finish the sentence, but I understood what she was asking. She wanted me there as a buffer, as backup, as the person who actually knew how to interact with her own children. "Of course," I said gently, though part of me wondered if my presence would make it too easy for Catherine to remain disengaged. David seemed to read my thoughts. "Actually, Margaret," he said, "I was wondering if you might use this time to run some errands. I'm sure you must have things you need to take care of, and Catherine and I can handle the children for a few hours." The suggestion sent panic across Catherine's features. She looked like someone who had just been told she would be performing a high-wire act without a net. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary," she said quickly. "Margaret should come with us. The children are used to her supervision. And maybe it's time they got used to their mother's supervision instead," David replied with that same gentle steel in his voice. I found myself caught between conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to go with them, to be there to help the children navigate their mother's awkwardness, to smooth over the inevitable friction when Catherine's parenting inexperience became obvious. But another part of me recognized what David was trying to do: force Catherine into a situation where she couldn't avoid direct engagement with her children. "I do have a few errands I could take care of," I said reluctantly. Catherine's expression suggested I had just betrayed her to enemy forces, but David smiled with approval. "Perfect," he said. "Take your time, Margaret. We'll be fine." As I watched them leave for the park, Catherine walking stiffly beside David while the children skipped ahead with excitement, I felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. This was either going to be a disaster of epic proportions, or it was going to force Catherine to discover what she had been missing all these years. I spent the afternoon running errands I had been putting off for weeks: grocery shopping, prescription pickup, a visit to the bank. But my mind was constantly at Central Park, imagining how the afternoon was unfolding. Was Catherine actually engaging with the children, or was she standing on the sidelines checking her phone? Were Emma, Jake, Sophie, and Matthew getting the maternal attention they craved, or were they being disappointed once again by their mother's emotional distance? When I returned to the mansion 3 hours later, I found the family in the kitchen, and the scene was unlike anything I had witnessed in 18 months of living in this house. Catherine was sitting at the kitchen island, her usually perfect hair slightly mussed, a grass stain on her expensive jeans, and something I had never seen before on her face: genuine animation. "Margaret," Emma called out as soon as she saw me. "Guess what? Mommy pushed me on the swings and she was really good at it." The pride in Emma's voice was unmistakable, and when I looked at Catherine, I saw a flush of pleasure on her cheeks. She had experienced something new and foreign: her daughter's approval, her daughter's joy at receiving maternal attention. "And she helped me build a sandcastle," Jake added. "It was huge. Uncle David took a picture." Sophie was practically bouncing with excitement. "Mommy said my drawing was beautiful. She wants me to make one for her office." Even Matthew, sitting in his high chair with dirt under his fingernails and leaves in his hair, was grinning broadly. "Mama play," he said, pointing at Catherine with obvious delight. Catherine looked exhausted but oddly exhilarated, like someone who had survived a challenging but ultimately rewarding experience. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her makeup had mostly worn off, and there was mud on her shoes. She looked more like an actual mother than I had ever seen her. "How was your afternoon?" I asked, genuinely curious about this transformation. "It was—" Catherine paused, seeming to search for the right word. "It was wonderful, actually. I had forgotten how funny they are, how creative. Sophie showed me this amazing game she made up, and Jake explained his entire Lego universe to me. And Emma—" She looked at her oldest daughter with something approaching wonder. "Emma is so smart, Margaret. She asks the most thoughtful questions." David caught my eye and smiled slightly, and I realized his gambit had worked. By forcing Catherine into unstructured time with her children, with no escape routes and no distractions, he had created an opportunity for her to discover what she had been missing. But would it last? Would this single afternoon be enough to change years of emotional distance and parental neglect? Or would Catherine return to her old patterns once the novelty wore off? That evening at dinner, Richard returned from his mysteriously time-consuming investment crisis to find his family transformed. The children were still chattering about their park adventure, and Catherine was actually listening, responding, engaging in a way that left Richard looking confused and slightly threatened. "You seem to have had quite a day," he said to Catherine, his tone carefully neutral. "We did," Catherine replied, and there was a warmth in her voice that I hadn't heard before when she talked about time with the children. "The children are extraordinary, Richard. Really extraordinary." Richard glanced at David with something approaching suspicion. "Yes. Well, I'm sure they behaved well for their uncle." "They behaved well for their mother," David corrected quietly. "Catherine did beautifully with them today." The compliment made Catherine's cheeks flush with pleasure, and I realized she was experiencing something completely new. Pride in her parenting, satisfaction from connecting with her children, the joy that comes from being needed and loved by the small people in your care. After dinner, as I was cleaning up, Catherine surprised me by staying to help instead of disappearing to make phone calls or review her calendar for the next day's social obligations. "Margaret," she said as we worked together, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you do it? How do you make it look so easy?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Being with them, knowing what they need, what they're thinking. Today I felt like I was learning a foreign language." I stopped washing dishes and turned to look at her. For the first time since I had known Catherine Whitmore, she looked vulnerable, uncertain, genuinely interested in learning something she didn't already know. "It's not about knowing some secret technique," I said gently. "It's about paying attention, about being present when you're with them, about asking questions and really listening to the answers. But what if you don't know what to say? Then you say that. Children appreciate honesty. They'd rather have you admit you don't know than pretend you're not paying attention." Catherine nodded thoughtfully, absorbing this information as if it were crucial intel for a business negotiation. "They love you so much," she said quietly. "Sometimes I think they love you more than they love me." The words hung between us, heavy with hurt and truth that was difficult to acknowledge. How could I respond to that? How could I tell her that love isn't about competition, that there was room in her children's hearts for both of us if she would just make the effort to claim her space? "They want to love you," I said finally. "They want their mother's attention and approval and affection more than anything else in the world. Today proved that. Did you see how they lit up when you engaged with them?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I've wasted so much time," she whispered. "Years of their lives, and I've just missed it all." "You can't get that time back," I said honestly. "But you can start now. They're still young, Catherine. There's still time to build the relationships you want with them." "Will you help me?" she asked, and the vulnerability in her voice was heartbreaking. "I don't want to mess this up." For the first time since I had known her, Catherine Whitmore was asking for help instead of giving orders. She was admitting she didn't know something important instead of pretending competence she didn't possess. She was putting her children's needs ahead of her own pride. "Of course," I said, "I want what's best for them, and what's best for them is having both parents who love and engage with them." That night, as I tucked the children into bed, each one was still glowing with happiness from their unusual day. Emma couldn't stop talking about how her mother had actually watched her perform on the monkey bars and had cheered when she made it all the way across. Jake kept mentioning how his mother had remembered the names of his favorite Lego characters. Sophie had started a new drawing, this one showing all 5 members of their family, including Catherine, holding hands under a bright sun. And Matthew, as I changed him into his pajamas, pointed at a photo on his dresser and said clearly, for the first time, "Mama." It was a breakthrough of monumental proportions, and as I settled him into his crib, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Maybe David's intervention would be enough. Maybe Catherine's awakening to her children's needs would continue. Maybe this family could heal the emotional wounds that years of neglect had created. But as I learned the next morning, hope and reality don't always align. I woke to the sound of raised voices carrying through the mansion's walls. Richard and David in what sounded like a serious argument. By the time I made it downstairs to start breakfast, David was gone, and Richard was in the kitchen with Catherine, both of them looking like they had been through a battle. "Where's Uncle David?" Emma asked as soon as she came downstairs for breakfast. "He had to leave," Richard said curtly. Something urgent came up. But I could see the truth in Catherine's expression. David hadn't left because of an emergency. He had been asked to leave. Richard had apparently decided that his brother's influence on the family dynamics was unwelcome, and David's experiment in forced family bonding was over. Catherine looked conflicted, torn between the joy she had discovered the day before and her loyalty to her husband. When the children asked if they could go to the park again, she hesitated, glancing at Richard before answering. "We'll see," she said, which the children correctly interpreted as probably not. Richard wasted no time in reasserting the old order. The children's tutors and instructors were contacted and rescheduled. Catherine's social calendar was restored to its previous busy state. The mansion returned to its familiar rhythm of structured activities and parental absence, but something had changed, and I could see it in Catherine's face whenever she looked at her children. The brief taste of genuine connection had awakened something in her, and she was struggling to reconcile her old patterns with this new awareness of what she had been missing. It was a week later when Richard called me into his study for a conversation I had been dreading but expecting. "Sit down, Margaret," he said, not looking up from the financial report spread across his mahogany desk. His study was a monument to wealth and success. Walls lined with leather-bound books that were never read, awards and certificates celebrating business achievements, framed photographs of Richard with politicians and celebrities and other titans of industry. But there were no pictures of his children, no evidence that family mattered to him beyond their potential impact on his social status. "I've been thinking about our conversation with David," Richard began, still focused on his paperwork, "about boundaries and appropriate relationships between staff and family members." I waited, my hands folded in my lap, preparing myself for what I knew was coming. "The children have become too dependent on you," he continued. "It's not healthy for them, and it's not sustainable for us as a family." The irony was breathtaking. This man, who spent more time managing his cryptocurrency portfolio than talking to his children, was concerned about their emotional health. This father, who could recite his quarterly dividend income but couldn't name his youngest son's favorite book, was worried about sustainability. "I see," I said quietly. "I found a replacement," Richard continued, finally looking up from his papers. "Mrs. Hartwell comes highly recommended. She's an older woman, very experienced, very professional. She understands appropriate boundaries." Mrs. Hartwell, no doubt a stern, elderly woman who would see the children as a job rather than as human beings deserving of love and attention. Someone who would maintain the emotional distance that Richard apparently preferred. "When would you like me to leave?" I asked, proud that my voice remained steady. 2 weeks from today," Richard said. "That should give you time to train Mrs. Hartwell and help the children adjust to the transition." 2 weeks. 14 days to say goodbye to 4 children who had become my world, who trusted me, who loved me, who would wake up one morning to find that another important person had disappeared from their lives without explanation or choice. "What will you tell them?" I asked. Richard looked confused by the question. "Tell them? About why I'm leaving, about what's happening." "We'll explain that you found another position," Richard said dismissively. "Children are resilient. They'll adjust." Resilient. As if Emma's sensitivity and Jake's anxieties and Sophie's artistic soul and Matthew's toddler attachment were just obstacles to be overcome rather than fundamental parts of who they were. As if losing another caregiver would build character rather than reinforce their growing understanding that love was temporary and unreliable. "And if they ask to stay in touch?" I pressed. Richard's expression hardened. That wouldn't be appropriate. Clean breaks are better for everyone involved. Clean breaks. As if you could amputate love surgically, as if 18 months of daily care and bedtime stories and playground adventures could be erased without leaving scars. I left Richard's study feeling hollowed out, as if something essential inside me had been carved away. 2 weeks to love these children openly before pretending they had never been mine to love. 2 weeks to memorize their faces, their voices, their particular ways of seeing the world before walking out of their lives forever. That evening, Catherine found me in the laundry room, mechanically folding the children's clothes while tears dripped steadily onto the small shirts and dresses that told the story of their daily adventures. "Margaret," she said softly, "are you all right?" I looked up at her. This woman who had finally begun to discover the joy of motherhood just as I was being forced to give up the closest thing to motherhood I would ever have again. "Richard told me about Mrs. Hartwell," she said quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Catherine sat down on the small chair beside the folding table, ignoring the fact that her designer dress was getting wrinkled. "I don't want you to go," she said quietly. The words were like a knife to my heart, too little, too late, but genuine nevertheless. "Then help me stay," I said desperately. "Talk to Richard. Make him understand what this will do to the children." Catherine's face crumpled with conflict. "I can't override his decision. He's their father." "And you're their mother," I replied. "Your voice should matter too." But we both knew that in the Whitmore household, Richard's voice was the only one that truly counted. Catherine had grown comfortable letting her husband make the difficult decisions, and she wasn't prepared to challenge his authority now, even for her children's well-being. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Her apology couldn't change anything, but it acknowledged the injustice of the situation, the unnecessary pain that was about to be inflicted on 4 innocent children who had committed no crime beyond loving me too much. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of precious last moments and growing dread. I helped Emma practice a new piece on the piano, knowing it would be the last time I heard her play. I built elaborate Lego constructions with Jake, memorizing his gap-toothed grin and his boundless enthusiasm for imaginary aliens and spaceships. I hung every one of Sophie's drawings on my bedroom wall, creating a gallery of stick figures and rainbows that would have to sustain me through whatever came next. And I held Matthew during his afternoon naps, feeling the warm weight of his sleeping body against my chest and trying to imprint the memory deep enough to survive the coming separation. Mrs. B. Hartwell arrived for her interview on a Thursday afternoon. A woman in her 70s with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and clothes that suggested she had never gotten grass stains or chocolate fingerprints in her entire professional life. She spoke to the children with polite distance, asking about their schedules and educational requirements, but showing no interest in their personalities, their fears, their dreams. "Very well-behaved children," she told Richard and Catherine after her brief meeting with Emma, Jake, Sophie, and Matthew. "With proper structure and boundaries, they should present no difficulties." No difficulties. As if Emma's sensitivity to criticism was a difficulty rather than a sign of her caring heart. As if Jake's need for patient explanation was a difficulty rather than evidence of his curious mind. As if Sophie's desire to share her artwork was a difficulty rather than proof of her generous spirit. As if Matthew's attachment to familiar caregivers was a difficulty rather than normal toddler development. I tried to prepare the children without frightening them, explaining that Mrs. Hartwell would be coming to help take care of them while I found a new position elsewhere. Emma was the first to understand the reality of what was happening. "You're leaving us?" she asked, her voice small and hurt. The question broke something inside me that I know would never fully heal. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that love isn't always enough, that adults make decisions that hurt children, that sometimes people who care about you have to go away even when no one wants them to? "I don't want to leave you," I said honestly. but sometimes grown-ups have to make changes, and this is one of those times. "But we need you," Emma whispered. "Who will help me with my reading? Who will come to my school plays?" I had no answer for her, because Mrs. Hartwell had made it clear that she considered school events to be beyond her professional responsibilities. Emma would join the ranks of children whose caregivers didn't attend their important moments, children who learned early that their achievements mattered less than adult convenience. Jake's response was anger, pure, unfiltered rage that someone was taking away another important person from his life. He'd already experienced disruption and change, and my leaving represented confirmation of his growing belief that people he loved would eventually disappear. "I hate this," he shouted, throwing his favorite Lego spaceship against the wall. "I hate everyone. I don't want Mrs. Hartwell. I want you." Sophie's reaction was the most heartbreaking of all. She stopped drawing, stopped creating the colorful artwork that had brightened every day of my time with her. When I asked why, she said simply, "What's the point? You won't be here to see them." And Matthew, sweet little Matthew, sensed the tension and sadness in the house, but couldn't understand its source. He became clingy, following me everywhere, crying when I left his sight even to go to the bathroom. His developing language skills weren't sufficient to express his confusion and fear, so his behavior became regression and anxiety. On my last night, I sat in each child's room for what I knew would be the final time. Emma cried quietly while I brushed her hair, both of us pretending this was just another ordinary evening even though we both knew it wasn't. Jake lay rigid in his bed, trying to be brave but unable to hide the tears streaming down his cheeks. Sophie had drawn me one final picture, a rainbow with clouds covering the sun, and pressed it into my hands without explanation. And Matthew wouldn't let me put him down, clinging to me with desperate strength, as if he could prevent my leaving through sheer force of will. "I will never forget you," I whispered to each of them. "Never, ever, ever. You will always be in my heart, no matter where I go or what I do. I love you more than words can say." The next morning, Mrs. Hartwell arrived early to begin her first official day. I helped her understand the children's routines, their preferences, their individual needs and quirks. She listened politely but with obvious disinterest, making notes about schedules and medical information, while showing no curiosity about personalities or emotional patterns. "They'll adjust," she said dismissively when I expressed concern about the children's distress over my departure. "Children always do." But I knew better. I knew that Emma would carry this abandonment with her, that Jake's anger would simmer and grow, that Sophie's creativity might never fully recover, that Matthew would struggle with trust and attachment issues that could last for years. The Whitmore children weren't just losing their nanny. They were losing their primary source of emotional stability, unconditional love, and genuine attention. Richard had arranged for a car to take me to my new lodging, a small apartment I had rented in Queens, far from the Upper East Side mansion and the children who had become my world. As I loaded my few belongings into the car, each child said goodbye in their own way. Emma hugged me tightly and whispered, "Promise you'll remember us." Jake pressed a small toy airplane into my hand, part of his precious Lego collection, and said gruffly, "So you don't forget about my spaceships." Sophie handed me an envelope full of her drawings, saying, "For when you're sad and need rainbows." And Matthew, held in Catherine's arms because he was too upset to stand on his own, reached toward me with both hands and cried, "Gaggy, Gaggy," in a voice that will haunt me for the rest of my life. As the car pulled away from the mansion, I looked back to see 4 small faces pressed against the front windows, watching me disappear from their lives just as David had disappeared the week before. I knew they were learning terrible lessons about the impermanence of love, the unreliability of adults, the futility of emotional attachment. The apartment in Queens was clean but small, a studio with a kitchenette, a Murphy bed, and a single window that looked out over a busy street. After 18 months in a mansion, it felt like a prison cell. But the physical constraints were nothing compared to the emotional emptiness that settled over me like a shroud. For 3 days, I barely left the apartment. I sat by the window, holding Sophie's drawings and Jake's airplane and the photograph of all 4 children that I had kept on my nightstand. The silence was deafening after 18 months of constant chatter, endless questions, and the delightful chaos of children living their lives at full volume. On the 4th day, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Catherine's number, and my heart leaped with hope that perhaps she was calling to say they had made a mistake, that the children needed me back, that Mrs. Hartwell wasn't working out. Instead, Catherine's voice was strained and worried. "Margaret, I'm sorry to bother you, but Matthew won't stop crying. He's been inconsolable since you left. He won't eat, he barely sleeps, and Mrs. Hartwell says she's never dealt with such extreme separation anxiety. I was wondering, do you have any suggestions?" The irony was crushing. They had dismissed me for being too attached to the children, but now they needed my expertise to deal with the trauma my dismissal had created. Matthew's behavior was a direct result of losing the primary attachment figure in his life, and there was no quick fix for that kind of emotional wound. "He's grieving," I told Catherine gently. "You took away the person he trusted most, and he doesn't understand why. He needs time, consistency, and extra patience while he learns to trust Mrs. Hartwell." "But how long will this last?" Catherine asked desperately. I wanted to tell her it might last months, that Matthew might carry trust issues from this experience for years, that toddlers don't recover from abandonment as easily as adults like to believe. Instead, I said, "Every child is different. Just be patient with him, and maybe spend extra time with him yourself. He needs to know he's still loved and safe." After Catherine hung up, I sat staring at my phone and crying tears of rage and grief. They could call me for advice, but they couldn't let me stay to provide comfort to a traumatized 3-year-old who just wanted his gaggy back. They could recognize my expertise when it was convenient, but they couldn't acknowledge my emotional importance to their children when it mattered most. Over the next few weeks, Catherine called several more times with questions about the children's needs and behaviors. Emma was struggling in school, her grades dropping, and her teacher expressing concern about her withdrawn demeanor. Jake had gotten into fights with classmates and been suspended for aggressive behavior. Sophie still wasn't drawing, spending most of her time staring out windows as if waiting for someone who was never coming back. "Mrs. Hartwell says they're being deliberately difficult," Catherine told me during one particularly desperate phone call. "She thinks they're testing boundaries and needs stricter discipline." Mrs. Hartwell's interpretation revealed everything wrong with her approach to childcare. These children weren't being difficult. They were being human. They were grieving, confused, angry, and scared. They needed understanding and comfort, not stricter discipline. "They're not being difficult," I said firmly. "They're processing a significant loss. They need extra support right now, not punishment." But I could hear the frustration in Catherine's voice, the way she was already beginning to view her children's emotional needs as problems to be solved rather than natural responses to trauma. "Mrs. Preto." Hartwell's professional distance was exactly what Richard had wanted, but it was destroying what remained of the children's sense of security and trust. The calls became less frequent as the weeks passed, and I knew that meant one of 2 things. Either the children were adjusting to their new reality, or Catherine was giving up on trying to understand their needs. Given what I knew about the family dynamics, I suspected it was the latter. 2 months after leaving the Whitmore mansion, I was working as a babysitter for several families in Queens, a patchwork of part-time positions that barely covered my rent, but kept me connected to children who still needed love and attention. None of these jobs provided the depth of relationship I had experienced with Emma, Jake, Sophie, and Matthew, but they reminded me that my capacity for love hadn't been diminished by my forced separation from the Whitmore children. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in February when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard a familiar voice that made my heart skip. "Margaret, this is David Whitmore, Richard's brother." I had wondered what had happened to David after his abrupt departure from the mansion, whether his confrontation with Richard had permanently damaged their relationship, whether he had given up on trying to help his nieces and nephew develop meaningful connections with their parents. "David," I said, genuinely glad to hear from him. "How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. And you? How are you settling into your new situation?" "I'm managing," I said, which was true enough even if it wasn't the whole truth. "I was wondering if we could meet," David said. "There are some things about the children, about what's been happening since you left, that I think you should know." My heart clenched with fear and hope. Were the children all right? Had something happened? Was there news about their adjustment to Mrs. Hartwell, or their parents' attempts to fill the emotional void my departure had created? We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Manhattan the following afternoon, and I spent the intervening hours alternating between anticipation and dread. Seeing David would mean hearing about Emma, Jake, Sophie, and Matthew, children I thought about every day but had no legitimate way to contact or check on. Part of me desperately wanted news of their well-being, while another part of me feared learning that they were thriving without me, that my love and care had been less essential than I had believed. David was waiting for me at a corner table when I arrived at the cafe, and he looked older than I remembered. Grayer around the temples, lines of worry etched more deeply around his eyes. He stood to greet me, and his hug was warm and genuine, the embrace of someone who understood loss and recognized it in others. "Thank you for coming," he said, as we settled into our seats with coffee and pastries. Neither of us seemed particularly interested in eating. "Tell me about the children," I said without preamble. "Are they all right?" David's expression was somber. "They're struggling, Margaret. More than Richard or Catherine wants to acknowledge. Emma's teacher has requested multiple parent conferences about her declining academic performance and social withdrawal. Jake has been to the principal's office 4 times this semester for disruptive behavior. Sophie hasn't spoken to Mrs. Hartwell beyond basic necessities. She answers direct questions but volunteers nothing. And Matthew—" He paused, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "Matthew is still asking for you. Every day. Mrs. Hartwell told Catherine that his constant crying for Gaggy is disruptive to the household routine, and she's recommended that they consider boarding school options for him, even though he's only 3 years old." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Boarding school for a traumatized toddler who was grieving the loss of his primary caregiver? The suggestion was so heartless, so fundamentally ignorant of child development and emotional needs, that I couldn't initially process it. "Boarding school?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Hartwell believes it would help him become more independent, less emotionally dependent on individual caregivers," David said, his tone making it clear what he thought of this professional assessment. I felt sick. Matthew wasn't emotionally dependent. He was emotionally healthy. His attachment to me had been normal, natural, and developmentally appropriate. His current distress was also normal, natural, and developmentally predictable. But instead of recognizing these responses as signs of a child who had experienced loss, Mrs. Hartwell was pathologizing his grief and recommending further separation as treatment. "Are Richard and Catherine considering it?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Richard thinks it might be efficient," David said. "Remove the source of disruption, restore order to the household. Catherine is conflicted. The brief taste of real connection she experienced during our park adventure gave her some insight into what she's been missing, but she's not strong enough to stand up to Richard's decision-making. Efficient. Richard was considering boarding school for his 3-year-old son because it was efficient. Not because it was best for Matthew, not because it would help him heal from his trauma, but because his grief was inconvenient for the household's smooth operation. There's more. David continued gently. "I've been trying to maintain some connection with the children, visiting when I can, calling to check on them. And Emma asked me something during my last visit that broke my heart." I waited, already sensing that whatever Emma had asked would be devastating. "She wanted to know if she had done something wrong to make you leave. She asked if maybe she hadn't been good enough, if perhaps her grades should have been better, if she should have been quieter or more helpful or less trouble." The words shattered something inside me. Emma, sweet 9-year-old Emma, was blaming herself for my departure. She was internalizing her abandonment as a personal failure, a reflection of her inadequacy rather than evidence of adult dysfunction. "Jake has convinced himself that if he's aggressive enough, difficult enough, they'll bring you back to handle him," David continued. "He's acting out because he thinks behavioral problems will prove they need you. And Sophie told me she stopped drawing because colors don't work when you're sad, and she doesn't remember how to be happy enough for rainbows." Each revelation was like a knife to my heart. These children weren't adjusting to my absence. They were being destroyed by it. Their behavioral changes weren't signs of healthy independence. They were symptoms of unresolved trauma and attachment injury. And instead of recognizing their pain and addressing it with compassion, the adults in their lives were pathologizing their responses and considering further interventions that would only compound their emotional damage. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was grateful for the information even as it broke my heart. David leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because I think there might be a way to fix this. Not immediately, not easily, but possibly." I stared at him, wondering what solution he could possibly see in such a heartbreaking situation. "Richard's business is facing some complications," David said quietly. "Nothing criminal, nothing that will destroy the family financially, but enough to create significant stress and require his full attention for the next several months. Catherine is overwhelmed trying to manage the children's emotional and behavioral problems, while Richard is distracted, and Mrs. Hartwell has given them an ultimatum. Either the children's behavior improves dramatically within the next month, or she'll be seeking other employment." I could see where this was leading, and despite everything that had happened, I felt a flutter of hope. "They need someone who actually knows these children," David continued. "Someone who understands their personalities, their fears, their needs. Someone who can help them heal from the trauma of the past few months and rebuild their sense of security and trust." "They dismissed me for loving them too much," I said quietly. "Why would they want me back?" "Because they're desperate," David replied bluntly. "Because their experiment with professional distance has been a disaster. Because even Richard is beginning to realize that managing children's emotional needs requires different skills than managing investment portfolios." We sat in silence for a moment while I tried to process the possibility that I might be able to return to the children who had never stopped living in my heart. "What would be different this time?" I asked finally. "How do I know they won't dismiss me again the moment things stabilize?" David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder of legal documents. "I've taken the liberty of having an employment contract drafted," he said. "Proper terms, guaranteed duration, specific job responsibilities, and protection against arbitrary dismissal. If you agree to return, it would be under very different circumstances than before." The folder felt heavy in my hands, weighted with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Could I put myself through the potential heartbreak of loving these children again, knowing that loss was always possible? Could I trust that Richard and Catherine had learned something from the disaster of the past few months? Could I believe that this time would be different? But as I thought about Emma blaming herself for my departure, Jake trying to force my return through aggressive behavior, Sophie forgetting how to be happy, and Matthew crying for his gaggy while facing the possibility of boarding school at age 3, I realized the question wasn't whether I could risk loving them again. The question was how I could live with myself if I didn't try to help them heal. I need to think about it, I said, though my heart had already made the decision. Of course, David replied, but don't take too long. Mrs. Hartwell's ultimatum expires in 3 weeks, and I'm not sure how much more damage the children can sustain while their parents scramble for solutions. That evening in my small Queens apartment, I spread the employment contract across my tiny kitchen table and read through every clause, every provision, every protection David had negotiated on my behalf. It was generous beyond anything I could have expected. A living wage, guaranteed health insurance, paid vacation, specific job duties that acknowledged my role as more than just custodial care. But more important than the financial terms were the emotional protections, language that recognized my bond with the children as beneficial rather than problematic, clauses that protected me from arbitrary dismissal except for cause, provisions that gave me some authority in decisions affecting the children's emotional and educational well-being. It was everything I should have had the first time, everything that might have prevented the heartbreak and trauma of the past few months. But would it be enough to ensure that history didn't repeat itself? I picked up my phone and dialed David's number before I could change my mind. "I'll do it," I said when he answered. "When do they want me to start?" The first morning back at the Whitmore mansion felt surreal, like stepping into a familiar dream that had been interrupted by a nightmare. The house looked the same. Marble floors still gleaming, crystal chandeliers still casting rainbow patterns on the walls, expensive artwork still hanging in perfect symmetry, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of sadness and dysfunction that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Hartwell met me at the front door with obvious relief. Her stern demeanor had cracked over the past 4 months of dealing with traumatized children whose behavior didn't respond to her professional distance and rigid boundaries. "Thank goodness you're here," she said without preamble. "I don't know what you did with these children before, but they've been impossible since you left. Perhaps you can talk some sense into them." I wanted to tell her that the children hadn't become impossible. They had become heartbroken. Their behavior was a natural response to loss and abandonment, and what they needed wasn't talking sense into them, but compassion, understanding, and time to heal. Instead, I simply nodded and asked where the children were. "The older 3 are at school," Mrs. Hartwell said. "Master Matthew is in his room. He's been difficult this morning." Difficult. The word that adults used when children's emotions were inconvenient, when grief looked like defiance and trauma manifested as behavior that didn't fit neatly into expected patterns. I climbed the familiar stairs to the 2nd floor, my heart pounding with anticipation and fear. What would Matthew's reaction be to seeing me again? Would he be angry that I had left? Would he remember me at all? Or had 4 months been too long in the life of a 3-year-old? His room was exactly as I remembered it. Walls painted soft blue, shelves lined with books and toys, the rocking chair where I had sung countless lullabies and read hundreds of bedtime stories. But Matthew himself looked smaller, thinner, as if grief had physically diminished him. He was sitting on his bed, holding a stuffed dinosaur and staring out the window with the kind of listless expression that belonged on much older faces. When he heard the door open, he turned toward me with automatic wariness. Then his face transformed with recognition, joy, and something that looked like disbelief. "Gaggy?" he whispered, as if saying my name too loudly might make me disappear again. "Hi, sweet boy," I said softly, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I'm back." For a moment, he just stared at me, and I could see him processing the reality of my presence, testing whether this was real or just another dream that would dissolve into disappointment. Then, with a sob that seemed to come from his very soul, he launched himself into my arms with the desperate force of a child who'd been waiting 4 months for this moment. "Gaggy came back!" he cried, clinging to my neck with such strength that I could barely breathe. "Gaggy came back. I missed you so much." I held him while he sobbed. 4 months of grief and confusion and abandonment pouring out in tears that soaked through my shirt and broke my heart all over again. He felt so small in my arms, so fragile, and I could feel his body trembling with the intensity of his emotions. "I missed you too, Matthew," I whispered into his hair. "So much. I thought about you every single day." "Why did you go away?" he asked when his sobs finally subsided enough for speech. "Did I be bad?" The question echoed Emma's concern about whether she had done something wrong to cause my departure, and I realized all 4 children had been carrying this burden of self-blame. They had internalized my dismissal as evidence of their own inadequacy, their own failure to be worthy of love and consistency. "You weren't bad at all," I told him firmly, pulling back so he could see my face and know I was telling the truth. "You are the best boy in the whole world. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense, but it's never because children are bad. Never." Matthew studied my face with the intense concentration of a child checking for deception. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded solemnly and settled back into my arms with a sigh that seemed to release some of the tension he had been carrying. "Are you going to stay now?" he asked quietly. It was the question I had been dreading, because the honest answer was complicated. I was back, yes, but with a contract that had an end date. I was committed to helping these children heal. But I couldn't promise forever in a world where adults made decisions that prioritized convenience over children's emotional needs. "I'm going to stay for a long time," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. "And while I'm here, we're going to have so many wonderful days together." Matthew seemed to accept this qualified promise, and we spent the next hour simply holding each other while he told me everything that had happened in my absence. His 3-year-old vocabulary wasn't sufficient to express his complex emotions, but I could read between the lines of his simple sentences. Mrs. Hartwell didn't read bedtime stories. Mommy was sad a lot. Daddy was gone more than before. Emma cried sometimes. Jake was angry. Sophie didn't make pictures anymore. Each revelation added another layer to my understanding of how my departure had affected not just Matthew, but the entire family dynamic. The children's distress had created stress for Catherine, who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her parenting responsibilities. Richard's business complications had removed him even further from the family equation, and Mrs. Hartwell's professional approach had created a sterile environment where the children's emotional needs went unmet and their behavioral responses were seen as problems to be managed rather than communications to be understood. When it was time to pick up the other children from school, Matthew insisted on coming with me, not just because he wanted the outing, but because he was terrified that if he let me out of his sight, I might disappear again. I understood his anxiety and didn't push for separation. Trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt gradually, and Matthew needed time to believe that my return was permanent rather than temporary. The walk to Emma's school felt like stepping back in time, but with awareness of everything that had changed. The Upper East Side streets were the same. Elegant brownstones, well-dressed pedestrians, the subtle markers of wealth and privilege that defined this neighborhood. But I was different now, more aware of my precarious position in this world, more conscious of how easily love could be dismissed and relationships severed when they became inconvenient. Emma was the first of the older children to see me, and her reaction was everything I had hoped for and dreaded. She stopped walking, stared at me with the same disbelief Matthew had shown, then ran toward us with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders and her blonde hair streaming behind her. "Margaret!" she cried, using my full name in her excitement. "You're really here! You came back!" But even as she hugged me, I could see the wariness in her eyes, the self-protection of a child who had learned that people she loved could disappear without warning. Her joy was tempered by fear, her excitement shadowed by the knowledge that this reunion might be temporary. "I missed you so much," she said, but there was a question in her voice. an unspoken plea for reassurance that this time would be different. "I missed you too, Emma," I said, stroking her hair. "So very much." Jake's reaction was more complicated. When he saw me, his face went through a series of emotions: surprise, joy, anger, and something that looked like betrayal. He walked toward us slowly, his 9-year-old pride warring with his desire to run into my arms. "Where have you been?" he asked, and I could hear the hurt beneath his accusatory tone. "I had to go away for a while," I said honestly, "but I'm back now." "Are you going to leave again?" The question was sharp, challenging, the voice of a child who had been disappointed too many times to accept easy reassurances. "I'm going to try very hard to stay," I told him, which was the most honest answer I could give without making promises I might not be able to keep. Jake studied my face for a long moment, then nodded curtly and fell into step beside us. He didn't reach for my hand or ask to be carried, but he stayed close enough that I knew he was struggling between his desperate desire for connection and his equally desperate need to protect himself from further abandonment. Sophie was waiting outside her classroom when we arrived, and her reaction broke my heart all over again. She saw me, and her face lit up with the same joy and disbelief the other children had shown. But then she seemed to remember something, and her expression closed down, became guarded and careful. "Hi, Margaret," she said politely, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the woman who had been her primary caregiver for 18 months. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied, kneeling down to her eye level. "I've missed your beautiful drawings." Sophie's composure cracked slightly. "I don't draw anymore," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because colors don't work when you're sad," she replied matter-of-factly, and I forgot how to be happy. The simple honesty of her statement was devastating. This 5-year-old had articulated something profound about grief and loss, that creativity requires a certain emotional state, that joy is necessary for the expression of beauty, that sadness can literally drain the color from the world. "Maybe we can remember together," I suggested gently. Sophie considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe," she said, but I could see the hope fighting with her fear of disappointment. The walk home was bittersweet, full of the joy of reunion but shadowed by the awareness of how much damage had been done in 4 months of separation. The children stayed close to me but maintained a careful emotional distance, as if they were afraid to fully invest in my return until they were certain it was real and lasting. Catherine was waiting when we arrived at the mansion, and her appearance shocked me. She had always been perfectly groomed, but now she looked tired, stressed, older than her years. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the weight loss that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. When she saw me with the children, her relief was palpable. "Margaret," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice that I had rarely heard before. "Thank you. Thank you for coming back." "Thank you for having me back," I replied, though we both knew the decision hadn't been entirely hers. That first evening back was careful and tentative, like a dance where everyone was afraid of stepping on someone else's feet. The children kept checking to make sure I was still there, still real, still planning to stay. Catherine hovered nervously, clearly wanting to help but unsure of her role now that I was back. Even Richard, who made a brief appearance at dinner, seemed subdued and perhaps slightly ashamed of the chaos that had ensued after my dismissal. Bedtime was the real test. For 4 months, the children had gone to sleep without bedtime stories, without the comfort rituals that had helped them feel safe and loved. Mrs. Hartwell had tucked them in efficiently but without warmth, checked that their lights were off and their doors were closed, but never lingered for the gentle conversations that helped children process their days and settle into peaceful sleep. Matthew, predictably, didn't want to let me out of his sight. He clung to me during his bath, held my hand while brushing his teeth, and refused to get into his crib until I promised multiple times that I would be there when he woke up. "Sing the dinosaur song," he requested, referring to a silly lullaby I had made up during his first week in the house, a nonsensical tune about friendly dinosaurs who helped little boys have sweet dreams. As I sang, watching his face relax and his eyelids grow heavy, I felt the familiar peace that came from being exactly where I belonged. This was my calling, my purpose, my joy, helping children feel safe and loved as they drifted into sleep. For 4 months, Matthew had gone to bed without this comfort, and I could see in his face how much he had missed it. Sophie was next, and when I entered her room, I was struck by how empty it looked. The walls that had once been covered with her colorful artwork were bare. Her art supplies sat unused on her desk, covered with a thin layer of dust that spoke of months of neglect. "Would you like me to read you a story?" I asked. Sophie nodded, then quietly added, "I saved some pictures for you, in case you came back." She pulled out a shoebox from under her bed and opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of drawings, stick figures and rainbows and flowers and houses that she had created during my absence but never displayed. The colors were muted compared to her earlier work, and many of the drawings showed gray skies and sad faces. But they existed. Despite her claim that colors don't work when you're sad, she had continued creating, preserving her art like hope, against hope that someday someone would care enough to see it. "They're beautiful," I said honestly, and Sophie's face lit up with the first genuine smile I had seen from her. Jake was more resistant to bedtime comfort, his pride still wounded from my departure, and his trust still fragile. But when I asked if he wanted to tell me about his Lego constructions, his defenses cracked slightly. "I built a new space station," he said reluctantly. "It's bigger than the old one. The aliens have more room now." "Are they still lonely?" I asked, remembering his earlier concern about alien companionship. Jake considered this seriously. "Some of them are, but some of them found families. It depends on whether people leave them or stay." The metaphor was transparent, and my heart ached for this 9-year-old boy who was processing abandonment through imaginative play about alien families. His Lego constructions had become a way to explore themes of loneliness, belonging, and the reliability of relationships, heavy concepts for someone so young to be grappling with. Emma was the most challenging because her emotional intelligence made her fully aware of the complexity of our situation. She wanted the comfort of our old routine, but she was also protecting herself from potential future disappointment. "I'm glad you're back," she said carefully as I sat on the edge of her bed. "But I don't understand why you left in the first place." It was a fair question, and she deserved an honest answer within the limits of what a 9-year-old could understand and process. "Sometimes adults make decisions that seem to make sense to them but don't make sense to anyone else," I said. "Your father thought it would be better for you if I weren't here, but it turned out he was wrong." "Will he think that again?" Emma asked, cutting right to the heart of her fear. "I don't know," I admitted, "but this time things are different. I have a contract that says I can stay for a long time, and your Uncle David is helping to make sure everyone understands how important it is for you to have people in your life who love you and stay." Emma nodded thoughtfully, processing this information with the seriousness of someone much older than her years. "I was afraid I had done something wrong," she said quietly, "to make you go away." "Oh, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into my arms. "You didn't do anything wrong, nothing at all. You are perfect exactly as you are. And anyone who gets to be part of your life is lucky to know you." As I turned off Emma's light and closed her door, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from being needed, from having a purpose that mattered, from being able to comfort children who had been needlessly wounded by adult decisions. But I also felt the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that these 4 children were depending on me not just for daily care, but for emotional healing from the trauma of the past 4 months. The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm that was familiar, but different from before. I was still providing the same loving care I had always given the children, but now there was an undercurrent of awareness, both theirs and mine, about the fragility of our arrangement. The children were gradually learning to trust that I was really staying, but they remained more clingy than before, more anxious about separations, more quick to check that I was still there. Catherine's involvement with the children had increased dramatically since my departure, not because she had suddenly discovered maternal instincts, but because Mrs. Hartwell's failures had forced her to recognize what the children needed. She was awkward and uncertain, but she was trying in ways she never had before. "Margaret," she said one afternoon as I was helping Emma with homework, "could you teach me how to do that?" "Do what?" "Help with homework. When you're not here, Emma gets frustrated and I don't know how to help her the way you do." It was a simple request, but it represented a fundamental shift in Catherine's approach to parenting. Instead of assuming that someone else would handle the difficult aspects of childcare, she was acknowledging that she needed to learn these skills herself. I showed her how to break down complex problems into smaller steps, how to offer encouragement without taking over, how to recognize when Emma was getting overwhelmed and needed a break. Catherine was an intelligent woman, and once she started paying attention to Emma's learning style and emotional needs, she began to understand why patience and praise were more effective than pressure and criticism. "She's so smart," Catherine said wonderfully as Emma worked through a particularly challenging math problem. "I never realized how creative her thinking is." "She's always been brilliant," I replied. "You just needed to slow down enough to see it." These small moments of connection between Catherine and her children were encouraging, but they also highlighted how much ground we needed to cover. 4 children with 4 different personalities, 4 different sets of needs, 4 different ways of processing the trauma they had experienced. Emma needed reassurance that she was worthy of love. Jake needed outlets for his anger and opportunities to rebuild trust. Sophie needed encouragement to rediscover her creativity. Matthew needed consistent presence and patient understanding as he learned that people he loved could stay. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after my return, during what started as an ordinary afternoon in Central Park. We had developed a new routine, less structured than their old schedule of lessons and activities, more focused on free play and family time. Catherine had begun joining us for these park visits, initially awkward but gradually more comfortable as she learned to see play as valuable rather than frivolous. Sophie had tentatively started drawing again, creating pictures that slowly began to include brighter colors and happier faces. On this particular afternoon, she was working on a large drawing while sitting on a park bench beside me, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. "What are you making?" Matthew asked, peering over her shoulder with the curious intensity of a 3-year-old. "It's our family," Sophie said, then paused and looked at me uncertainly. "Is it okay to put you in our family picture?" The question was heartbreaking in its complexity. Sophie understood that I wasn't technically part of their family, but she also knew that I functioned as family in every way that mattered to her daily life. She was asking permission to acknowledge the relationship that meant everything to her, but that adults had told her was somehow inappropriate. Before I could answer, Emma looked up from the book she was reading and said firmly, "Of course Margaret belongs in our family picture. She takes care of us and loves us and helps us with everything. That's what family does." "But she's not our real family," Jake said, but his tone was uncertain rather than argumentative. "What makes someone real family?" Emma asked, displaying the philosophical bent that made her such an interesting conversationalist. Jake considered this seriously. "Living in the same house? Taking care of each other? Loving someone even when they're annoying? Then Margaret is real family," Sophie concluded with 5-year-old logic. "She lives in our house and takes care of us and loves us even when we're cranky." Catherine, who had been listening to this conversation while pushing Matthew on a swing, stopped and walked over to our bench. Her expression was thoughtful, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "You know what I think?" she said, sitting down beside Sophie. I think families can be made in different ways. Some families are connected by blood, and some families are connected by love. Margaret is part of our family because she loves you and you love her, and that's what matters most." It was a remarkable statement from a woman who had once worried about the children becoming too attached to their caregiver. Catherine's journey toward understanding the importance of emotional connection had been slow and sometimes painful, but she had arrived at something profound: the recognition that love creates family bonds that are just as real and valuable as biological ones. Sophie beamed and returned to her drawing, now confidently placing me in the center of the family group. Emma smiled with satisfaction at having her philosophical inquiry validated. Jake nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to him, and Matthew clapped his hands with delight at being included in such an important conversation. That evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Richard appeared in the kitchen, an unusual occurrence that immediately put me on guard. Our interaction since my return had been polite but distant, and I was never entirely sure where I stood with him. "Margaret," he said, "could I speak with you for a moment?" My heart started pounding, but I followed him to his study, the same room where he had dismissed me 6 months earlier. The financial report still covered his desk, the awards still lined the walls, but something felt different about the space. Less intimidating, perhaps, or maybe I was different, more confident in my value and my rights. "I owe you an apology," Richard said without preamble, which was not what I had expected to hear. I waited, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected opening. "I made a mistake," he continued, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. I believed that the children's attachment to you was problematic, that they needed to be more independent, more self-reliant. I was wrong." The admission hung in the air between us, and I could see how difficult it was for him to acknowledge his error in judgment. "The past few months have been—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Educational. Watching my children struggle, seeing how much they were hurting, realizing that I had removed the one person who truly understood their needs. It's been a learning experience I wouldn't wish on any parent." "They're resilient," I said quietly. "They'll heal." "Thanks to you," Richard replied. "But they shouldn't have needed to heal from decisions I made. They shouldn't have been put through that kind of trauma because I was too proud or too ignorant to recognize what you meant to them." We sat in silence for a moment, and I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: sympathy for this man who had caused so much pain through his inability to understand emotional complexity. Richard wasn't cruel or malicious. He was simply someone who had built his life around quantifiable successes and was struggling to navigate the unquantifiable realm of human relationships. "I don't want to make the same mistake again," he said finally. "That's why David helped draft your contract with such specific protections. I want you to know that your position here is secure, that the children's relationship with you is valued, not threatened." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. "There's something else," Richard continued. "Catherine and I have been discussing changes to how we approach parenting, how we prioritize family time. We realize we've been absent from too much of their lives, that we've expected you to fill roles that should have been shared between all of us." This was an even more unexpected admission. Richard was acknowledging not just his mistake in dismissing me, but his broader failures as a parent. "We're not asking you to do less," he clarified quickly. "The children need you, and we respect that relationship. But we want to do more. Be more present, more engaged. Learn from your example instead of feeling threatened by it." It was everything I had hoped for during those 18 months of invisible service: recognition that the children needed both professional care and parental involvement, acknowledgement that love wasn't a zero-sum game where the children's attachment to me diminished their need for their parents. Over the following months, the Whitmore family slowly transformed. Catherine continued learning how to engage with her children's daily lives, attending school events, helping with homework, joining us for park outings, not as an obligation, but as someone who was genuinely discovering the joy of watching her children grow and learn. She was still awkward sometimes, still uncertain about the nuances of child development, but her effort was genuine, and the children responded to her increased attention with enthusiasm. Richard's changes were more subtle, but equally significant. He began having breakfast with the family instead of immediately disappearing into his study. He started asking about the children's days, their friends, their interests. One evening, I found him in Jake's room, sitting on the floor and listening with apparent fascination as Jake explained the complex political system he had created for his Lego alien civilization. "The green aliens are the scientists," Jake was saying seriously, "and the blue aliens are the explorers. But they all work together because they learned that cooperation is better than competition." "That's very wise," Richard replied, and I could tell he was genuinely impressed by his son's creativity and thoughtfulness. These moments of connection were still relatively rare, but they represented progress that 6 months earlier had seemed impossible. The children were slowly learning that they could love me without losing their parents' attention, that emotional attachment wasn't a limited resource that had to be rationed. But the most significant change was in the children themselves. Emma's confidence returned as she felt secure in her relationships with the important adults in her life. Her grades improved, her social anxiety decreased, and she began participating in school activities with enthusiasm instead of worry. Jake's aggressive behavior disappeared as his need for stability and attention was met through positive rather than negative means. He threw himself into creative projects, not just Lego constructions, but stories, drawings, elaborate games that showcased his impressive imagination. Sophie's artistic renaissance was perhaps the most visible transformation. Her drawings became brighter and more complex, filled with intricate details and joyful scenes that reflected her renewed sense of security. She started an art project chronicling our family's activities. Pictures of park visits, bedtime stories, homework sessions, lazy Sunday mornings that created a visual narrative of love and permanence. And Matthew, sweet Matthew, blossomed into the confident, talkative, affectionate child he had been before my departure. His vocabulary exploded as he felt secure enough to explore language and communication. His play became more imaginative and interactive as he trusted that the adults in his life would be present to share his discoveries. The talk of boarding school disappeared entirely as everyone recognized that his attachment needs were normal and healthy, not problematic. 1 year after my return to the Whitmore mansion, David visited for Emma's 10th birthday party, a celebration that was dramatically different from the sterile, adult-focused events the family had previously hosted. This party included Emma's school friends, games in the backyard, a homemade cake that Catherine and Sophie had decorated together, and genuine laughter from both children and adults. As the party wound down and the children were upstairs getting ready for bed, David and I found ourselves sitting on the back terrace, where he had first told me about Richard's plan to dismiss me. "Look what you've built," he said, gesturing toward the house where we could hear the sounds of a functioning, loving family. Catherine reading bedtime stories in her improving but still slightly uncertain voice. Richard helping Jake organize his ever-expanding Lego collection. Sophie singing to herself as she drew in her room. Matthew chatting with his stuffed animals about the day's adventures. "It wasn't just me," I said honestly. "They all had to choose to change, to prioritize differently, to value relationships over convenience. But you were the catalyst," David replied. "You showed them what love looks like in action, what children need to thrive, what a family can become when people commit to showing up for each other." As I sat there listening to the sounds of the children settling into sleep, secure, loved, confident that tomorrow would bring more of the same stability and care, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point, the heartbreak of dismissal, the months of separation, the slow work of rebuilding trust and healing trauma. But mostly I thought about love, how it survives separation, how it creates family bonds that transcend traditional definitions, how it transforms everyone it touches when it's given freely and received openly. These 4 children had taught me that motherhood isn't defined by biology, but by daily acts of care, attention, and unconditional commitment. And I had taught them that they were worthy of love, deserving of attention, capable of trust even after disappointment. The Whitmore mansion was the same elegant residence it had always been, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers and priceless artwork. But now, it was also something more precious. A home where children felt safe, where love was expressed openly, where family meant everyone who showed up with consistency and care. As I walked upstairs to check on the children one final time, before going to my room, a larger room now, with windows overlooking the park, furnished with respect for my permanent place in this household, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. Emma was already asleep, her birthday presents arranged carefully on her dresser, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Jake had fallen asleep with a book about space exploration open on his chest, his dreams presumably filled with aliens and adventures. Sophie's walls were covered with her latest artwork, bright, cheerful scenes of family activities and rainbow skies, and Matthew was sleeping peacefully in his toddler bed, his dinosaur pajamas slightly twisted, but his breathing deep and relaxed. 4 children who had taught me that love multiplies when it's shared, that family is created by choice and commitment, that healing is possible even after profound hurt. 4 children who had given my life meaning and purpose, who had allowed me to be mother when motherhood had been stolen from me by loss. As I settled into my own bed, surrounded by Sophie's artwork and Jake's small gifts and Emma's thoughtful notes and Matthew's innocent drawings, I thought about all the women like me, the nannies, babysitters, housekeepers, caregivers who love other people's children as if they were our own. Women who know that family isn't always defined by blood, that love isn't always recognized by law, that the most important work we do is often invisible to everyone except the small hearts we help to heal. If you're listening to this story while caring for children who aren't technically yours, while cleaning up after people who don't always see you, while giving your heart to families who might not realize how much you've invested, I want you to know that your love matters. Your presence makes a difference. The children in your care are better because you chose to love them, and someday they'll understand what a gift that was. The Whitmore children are teenagers now, all 4 thriving in their own ways. Emma is in high school, confident and kind, planning to study education because she wants to help children the way I helped her. Jake is fascinated by engineering and still builds elaborate constructions, though now they're robots instead of alien space stations. Sophie is a talented artist whose work reflects the joy and security of her childhood, and Matthew is a happy, well-adjusted boy who calls me by my name now but still gives the best hugs in the world. They all understand that families can be created by choice, that love is measured by consistency rather than biology, that the people who show up during your childhood are the ones who shape who you become as an adult. Have you ever cared for children who weren't technically yours, but felt like yours in every way that mattered? Have you ever loved someone else's family so much that losing them felt like losing yourself? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe. It helps us reach other women who pour their love into other people's children, who know that caregiving is both the hardest and most important work in the world. For more stories about the invisible heroes who keep families functioning, click the link to our special podcast series. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and I'll see you in our next story about love, loss, and the families we choose for ourselves.